A somewhat distracted and scattered conversation followed, Dina trying to maintain a train of thought with Doob while fielding sporadic, peremptory interruptions from Rufus. "Something kind of weird just happened on the radio," she said. "Do you want a drink? It's evening for you, right?"
"I pretty much always want one," Doob said. "Let's not worry about it. What's up?"
Dina related the story. Doob looked distracted at first, perhaps because of all the ham radio jargon, but focused when she showed him the MAC addresses.
"The simplest explanation," he pointed out, "is that it's a troll, just messing with you."
"But how would a troll know about those MAC addresses? We don't give those out. We don't want our robots getting hacked from the ground."
"The PR people have come through here, haven't they? Taking pictures of you in your robot lab? Mightn't it be the case that a picture got snapped when you had that box open, and some of those PC boards visible?"
"There's no gravity in here, Doob. I can't leave things lying around on my desk."
"Because," Doob said, "obviously, what's going on here is that someone wants to talk to you through a private channel."
"And they are proving their identity by mentioning numbers that could only be known to a few people. I get it."
"And all I'm saying is that a really sophisticated troll would look for some detail like that in the background of a NASA publicity photo as a way to fool you."
"Noted," Dina said, "but I doubt it."
"Who do you think it is, then?"
"Sean Probst," Dina said. "I think it's the Emir expedition." Doob got a distracted look.
"Man, I haven't thought about those guys in ages."
It was strange that a story as epic and as dramatic as the voyage of Emir could go forgotten, but those were the times they lived in. The ship had stopped communicating and then disappeared against the backdrop of the sun about a month after its departure from low Earth orbit, Leo, around day 126. A few sightings on optical telescopes had confirmed that it had transitioned into a heliocentric orbit, which might have happened accidentally or as the planned result of a controlled burn. Assuming it was following its original plan, Emir should then have made almost 2 full loops around the sun. Since its orbit was well inside of Earth's, the perihelion was halfway between the orbits of Venus and Mercury, it would have done this in just a little more than a year, grazing the orbit of Gregg's skeleton, comet Grigg-Skellerup, a couple of 100 days ago. But this would have occurred when it was on the far side of the sun from the Earth, making it difficult to observe. The next event would have been a small matter of impregnating the comet's core, or a piece of it, with an exposed nuclear reactor on the end of a stick, and then turning it on to generate thrust by blowing a plume of steam out the entry hole. They would have done a large burn, pulling out the reactor's control blades, powering it up, and releasing a plume of steam that would have altered the comet's trajectory by about 1 kilometer per second, enough to put it on a collision course with Earth, or at least with L1, a couple of 100 days later. The timing was awkward, and many had griped about it, wondering why Sean hadn't gone after some other comet, or plotted some other course that might have brought it home a little sooner. But people who knew their way around the solar system understood that it was near miraculous good fortune for any comet core to be in a position to be grappled and moved in such a short span of time. The hasty shake-and-bake nature of the Emir expedition, which had stirred up so much controversy, had been forced by the implacable timeline of celestial mechanics. Time, tide, and comets waited for no man. And even if it had been possible to bring a comet back sooner, it would have been reckless and politically impossible. What if the calculations were wrong and the comet slammed into the Earth? So, the plan of the Emir expedition was the only one that could have worked, if indeed it were working at all, and since much of the action, the rendezvous with the comet and the burn of the nuke-powered steam-fueled engine, had occurred while it was on the far side of the sun, this had been very much in doubt until a couple of months ago, when astronomical observations had proved conclusively that comet Grigg-Skellerup had changed its course, something that could only have happened as the result of human intervention. The comet was headed right for them. It would have triggered mass panic on Earth had Earth not already been doomed. Since then, they had watched its orbit converging slowly with that of Earth and plotted the time when it would disappear against the Sun once more as it reached L1. The reactor would then have to be powered up again, as a huge burn would be needed to synchronize Emir's orbit with Earth's and pilot it through L1 to a long ellipse that would bring it their way. "I think about them every day," Dina answered.
"When are they supposed to hit L1?
"Any time, but it's going to be a long burn. They might sort of grease it in over a period of a few days rather than trying to do one sharp impulse."
"Makes sense,"
Doob said.
"One high-G maneuver might cause the ice to break apart. When was the last time they communicated?"
"On the X-band? The real radio? A few weeks after they left. Almost 2 years ago, but clearly they're still alive, so it must have been radio failure."
"Well, let's go with that theory,"
Doob suggested.
"Jury-rigging a new radio that would transmit over such a distance would be kind of hopeless. The best they could hope for would be to cook something up that might work when they got closer, and to settle for lower bandwidth."
"My dad used to talk about spark gap transmitters," Dina said. "It was a technology they used—"
"Back before transistors and vacuum tubes, yes,"
Doob said. Dina telegraphed down. "Does QET sound like an old-time Sparky to you?" Rufus returned. "Yes, come to think of it." "They took some of my robots with them," Dina said. "All they would have to do is jot down the MAC addresses on those units' interface boards, and they'd have a sort of crude proof of identity. As a matter of fact—" And she began to pull up some of the records she had made almost 2 years ago of the robots and part numbers issued to Sean and his crew. Within a few minutes, she was able to verify that the MAC address that had come in via Morse code a few minutes ago matched one on a robot that had been taken to Emir.
"Who has access to the file you just consulted?"
Doob asked, still in devil's advocate mode. "Are you kidding? You know how Sean is with the encryption and everything. All of this stuff is locked down. I mean, I'm sure the NSA could get in, but not some random prankster."
"Just checking,"
Doob said.
"It seems awfully roundabout is all I'm saying. Why doesn't he just broadcast something like, 'Hey Dinah, it's me, Sean, my radio's busted'? That would seem easier."
"You have to know Sean," Dinah said. "Look, anything he sends out over that channel is getting broadcast to basically the entire Earth. It's going to go up on the internet. Everyone's going to know his business. He has no idea what the situation is. There's no internet up there, and his radio's been out for a long time. He doesn't even know if anyone is alive up here or if there's been a military coup or something. He doesn't want to come back here if we've turned into the Klingon Empire."
"I think you're right,"
Doob said.
"He's going to ease into it, test the waters."
45 minutes later, Dinah was taking down a new message from QET. It started with RTFM5, then the number 00001, and went on as an apparently meaningless series of random letters. "The only part I understand is read the fucking manual," Dinah said, followed by the number 5.
"Did he bring any manuals up with him?"
"He brought a bunch of stuff," Dinah said, "from the engineers in Seattle, and left some of it here."
"You have a faraway look in your eye, Dinah."
"I remember asking him, 'Why did you print that stuff out? Why not use thumb drives like everyone else?' And he said, 'Owning your own space company brings some perks,'" Dinah said. She found them after a few minutes rummaging in storage bins. Half a dozen 3-ring binders, volumes 1 through 6, of the Arjuna Expedition's employee manual. The entire stack was a foot thick. Doob whistled.
Given the cost per pound of launching stuff into space, this is probably worth more than the Gutenberg Bible that showed up last week.
They went straight to Volume 5, which, for the most part, looked like any other corporate employee manual. But in between the sexual harassment policy and the dress code was a half-inch thick stack of pages with no readable content at all. Random sequences of capital letters had been printed all over them, in groups of 5, column after column, row after row, all the way down each page. Each of these pages had a different number at its top, beginning with 00001. "This is the Boy Adventure secret code shit that Lars always used," Dinah said. "But I'll be damned if I know—"
I'm embarrassed to say that I know exactly what this is,
Doob said.
These are one-time pads. It's the simplest code there is, but the most difficult to break, if you do it right. But you have to have this.
And he rattled page 00001 in his hand. Once Doob had explained how it worked, Dinah was able to begin decrypting the message by hand, but in a few minutes Doob had written a Python script that made it easy to finish the job.
I came here thinking I was going to have a drink and chat about asteroid mining,
he said. "Oh, stop grumbling. This is way more interesting," Dinah said. The message read, "Two alive, thrusting at full power, send sitrep."
There were 6 in the original crew, right?
Doob asked. "Something must have happened," Dinah said. "Maybe they hit a rock or something, damaged the antenna, lost some people. Maybe the radiation got to them."
Well, it sounds like they are coming back,
Doob said. "Yeah, unless—"
Unless what?
"Unless he just wants to hang out at L1. That would be a hell of a lot safer. I don't think any moon shards are going to make it out that far." Doob reread the message.
You're right,
he said.
All he says is that they're thrusting. Nothing about transferring back to low Earth orbit. Then he asks for a situation report.
He put his hands over his face and rubbed it.
I'm fading,
he announced.
I should be Skyping my family right now.
"Get out of here," Dinah said. "I can work on the report, and I can encrypt it now that you showed me how it works." Doob pushed off and drifted to the exit, then caught himself and turned back.
I could figure this out myself, he said, but it's late. Maybe you know off the top of your head. If Sean goes into that transfer orbit from L1 to here, how long before he shows up?
37 days, Dinah said.
About 17 days into the hard rain,
Doob said.
Awkward timing.
Dinah looked back at him. She didn't say a word, but he knew what she was thinking. If only awkward timing were the worst of our problems.
Okay,
Doob said.
Thanks, Dinah.
Next time, she said, and made a drinky-drinky motion with her thumb and pinky.
Next time,
he agreed, and pushed through the curtain. Dinah checked the time. Now that she knew roughly where Emir was, she understood the timing of the transmissions. During a certain part of each 93-minute orbit, Izzy was on the wrong side of the Earth and couldn't receive Sean's signal. Following each blackout period was a window during which they could talk. They had just burned a window, taking down his transmission and decrypting it, and were about to go into blackout again. During that span of time, Dinah should be able to write a short message and get it encrypted using the next one-time pad. What to write wasn't entirely clear. She could provide some obvious data like the number of arklets currently in orbit, the number of people, how many robots she had up and running, but she suspected that Sean wanted a different kind of information. He wanted to know what would happen were he to show up 37 days from now with a mountain of ice. The Cloud Ark could use it, that was for sure. Likewise, Sean needed the Cloud Ark. 2 guys on a spaceship pushing a giant ball of ice was not a sustainable civilization. But Sean was going to be cagey. He was going to want something. He would want to make a deal. He would want to make a deal with Dinah's boyfriend. One step at a time. Just sending him a few basic stats would occupy the next transmission window. Rather than driving herself crazy worrying about the longer game, Dinah focused on that through the next blackout period, writing up a message as tersely as possible and then encrypting it using Doob's Python script. The L1 point of the Earth-Sun system was located on a straight line between those two bodies. Emir, for all practical purposes, was at L1. So generally speaking, when Izzy swung around the dark side of the Earth and emerged into the sunlight, it meant that they could see L1 and communicate with Emir. This next occurred at about 7:30 a.m. Greenwich time, which happened to be sunrise in London. Dinah, gazing down out her little window, was able to see the Terminator, the dividing line between the day and night sides of Earth, creeping over the Thames estuary down below, and lighting up a few tall spires in the London financial district. Then she turned to her telegraph key, established contact with Emir, and tapped out her message. This ended up consuming the entire transmission window. She had to send the characters very slowly because Sean wasn't very good at reading Morse code, and because the message was encrypted, he wasn't able to guess missing letters from context, and so every letter had to be read clearly. By the time she was finished, Izzy had swung almost halfway around the world and was about to plunge back into night. She finished her transmission with TBC, which she hoped they would understand as to be continued, then went right back to work writing and encrypting a supplement. She was getting ready to open another broadcast window a little before 9 a.m. London time, or .9 in Izzy speak, when Ivy floated in without knocking. "I want to look out your window," she announced. "That's fine," Dinah said. "What's up?" Because obviously something was up. Ivy's face looked funny, and she had said your window, not your window. "What's so special about my window?" Dinah asked. "It's next to you," Ivy said. "Is everything okay?" Dinah asked, because clearly everything wasn't. Her first thought was that the Morse code transmissions had been intercepted and that Dinah was in trouble. But if that were the case, Ivy would not be in here asking to look out her window. She looked at her friend. Ivy went immediately to the window and then positioned herself to look down at the Earth. By now, the Terminator had advanced to the point where it had lit up the easternmost bulge of South America. Izzy was about to cross the equator, which was almost directly below them. "I heard from Cal," Ivy said. She said it without the usual note of pleasure in her voice. "That's good. I thought his boat was underwater." "It was until a couple of hours ago." "They popped up?" "They popped up." "Where?" "Down there," Ivy said. "How do you know?" Dinah asked. "Surely he's not beaming you his coordinates." "I can tell," Ivy said, "by putting two and two together." "What did he say?" "He said to prepare for some launches out of Kourou." "They're going to reopen the spaceport?" Ivy gasped. Dinah glided over and got right behind Ivy, hugging her and hooking her chin over Ivy's shoulder so that she could share the same viewing angle. They knew where Kourou was. They looked at it all the time, and sometimes even saw the bright plumes of rocket engines on the launch pads. What Ivy had reacted to was a little different. Sparks of light were appearing along the coast, spreading and fading. A barrage of them, peppered across the interval between the beach and Devil's Island. "What the hell are those?" Dinah asked. "Are those nukes?" "I don't know," Ivy said. Then Dinah's question was answered by a much brighter light that flared along the coast to the northwest, fading slightly to a luminescent ball that tumbled upward toward space. "I think that was a nuke," Ivy said. We just nuked Venezuela? It took a few moments for their eyes to adjust. That was just as well, since their minds had to do some adjusting as well. Once the light had faded, they could see that the mushroom cloud was actually offshore of the Venezuelan landmass, a few miles out to sea. A demonstration shot. Visible from Caracas? Dina asked. Partly that, Ivy said. But yesterday they were saying that the whole Venezuelan Navy was headed for Kuru to restore order. I'll bet that Navy no longer exists. The smaller fireballs. Near the spaceport? I'm going to guess fuel-air explosives. They would do almost as much damage as tactical nukes, without contaminating the launch site. Ivy had shrugged loose from Dina's embrace and turned around so that her back was to the window. They were now hovering close to each other. Dina finally got it. You said that Cal's boat had popped up, that it was on the surface, that he knew something. You think... I know, Ivy mouthed. Cal had received the order, direct from JBF, and he had launched the nuke. He'd probably launched cruise missiles with fuel-air devices as well. People assumed that Ivy and Dina had grown apart in the last year, but then people had assumed that they were at odds to begin with. There was no point in trying to keep track of what people imagined. Ivy's loss of her position to Dina's boyfriend hadn't made matters any simpler. But things had never been bad between them, just complicated. Ivy was pretty articulate, but there wasn't a lot about the current situation that could be talked through. After a few minutes, though, she found a way. I guess what sucks is that all I'm going to have of him is memories, Ivy said. And I was trying to cultivate some good ones to carry with me. She wasn't exactly crying, but her voice had gone velvety. You know he had no choice, Dina said. The chain of command is still in effect. Of course I understand that, Ivy said. Still, it's just not what I wanted. We knew it was going to get ugly, Dina said. Her radio started beeping. Speaking of which, who the hell is that? Ivy asked. Sean Probst, Dina said. He's back. Ivy hung out in Dina's shop for a while, as Dina laboriously keyed out the second half of her situation report. By the time South America had passed from view, long trails of black smoke were streaking northeast from the burning wreckage of the People's Justice blockade and casting shadows on the wrinkled skin of the Atlantic. Bright sparks had appeared over Kuru again, but now they were the incandescent plumes of solid boosters chucking heavy lift vehicles into the sky. Back in business, Ivy said. I guess I better revise those spreadsheets. You think Cal is still on the surface? Still reachable? I doubt it, Ivy said, in a tone of voice that suggested she wouldn't know what to say to him. I don't think it's standard practice to launch a nuclear missile and then just hang out. Certain aspects of Cloud Ark culture were more objectionable than others to Dr. Moira Crew. She just didn't think it was decent to live in a place where there were no coffee shops to have breakfast in when she woke up, and no public houses in which to socialize at day's end. This was partly the result of overcrowding, partly because people lived on 3 different shifts, so there was no unanimity as to when morning and evening fell, and partly because the place had been hastily designed by American and Russian engineers who were blind to the importance of such things. She'd had a number of good chats about it with Louisa, who understood, and they had formed a sort of vague resolution to do something about it once the hard rain had begun and the Cloud Ark had settled into some kind of long-term routine. Moira's dream was to be the proprietor of an establishment, perhaps constructed in a single arklet, that would serve that purpose. But she had not yet worked out how to get the timing just right. Of course, she knew that she had much more important duties. The responsibility of perpetuating the human race, and most other species, was largely on her shoulders. It wouldn't do for her to spend hours every day pulling espresso shots and wiping down counters. They didn't even have the capability yet of growing coffee or barley in space, so the supply of consumables was going to run out pretty damned soon, and her pub would end up serving Tang. But it was a dream. And in the meantime, she could use the coffee room adjacent to the farm as a sort of R&D laboratory. Arising each day at dot 8, she would make her way back to H2, descend a spoke to the T3 Taurus, make herself a cup of the reprehensible freeze-dried coffee and a little bowl of equally bad freeze-dried oatmeal, and then go to a little conference table in the middle of the farm and have a sit. As often as not, she would be joined by other sleepy-eyed third-shifters. Marcus Luker was one of them, and generally too busy to just sit and drink coffee with people, but he would make time for her occasionally. Conrad Barth sometimes joined her, as did Rhys Aitken, and from time to time Tekla would show up. Of these, Tekla was the most curious and interesting case on more than one level. To put it bluntly, she was of a different social caste. Moira, Doob, Conrad, Rhys, and many of the other members of the general population were the sorts of people who might once have encountered each other at TED or Davos, or appeared together on panels at think tanks. Not Tekla. Her curious career as one of the rare female members of the Russian military, an Olympic athlete, a test pilot, and a cosmonaut certainly made her interesting enough to be invited to a TED-like conference. But her lack of fluency in English and a certain degree of social awkwardness would have ruled her out as a presenter. The lacerations she had suffered during her escape from the crippled Luke had been sewn up by amateurs. On Earth, she'd have gone straight into the care of a plastic surgeon, but on Izzy, she'd just accepted the results. Moira wished she spoke better Russian so that she could talk to Tekla about her ideas regarding appearance and grooming. The facial scars put her well outside the norms of feminine beauty, and she had doubled down by electing to keep the buzz cut. In spite of this, or perhaps because of it, she was, to put it bluntly, kind of hot. Moira hated to say it. But hotness was a part of the human condition, and it was pointless to pretend that it did not exist. Moira herself was largely heterosexual. When younger, she had slept with 2 different women, one in the English Cambridge and one in the Massachusetts Cambridge. This had been perfectly all right, and she in no way regretted it, but it had required an awful lot of thinking. Way too much cerebration about gender and queer theory had preceded and succeeded those brief moments of passion, and those relationships had faded from her life. It had occurred to her, in spite of efforts to keep such thoughts at bay, that Tekla would be an altogether different style of partner, and she had to admit that she found this pretty interesting. There was an entire story about Tekla's sexuality that had begun a few weeks after her rescue with some kind of elaborate soap opera. A love triangle or quadrangle involving both men and women, loosely enshrined in the oral history of Izzy, but not something Moira had ever cared to learn more about. The gist of it was that after a few months, Tekla had begun openly sleeping with other women, eliciting vast amounts of analysis and commentary and drama. The analysis had tended to come from gender theorists talking about the somewhat uncomfortable fact that Tekla was an athlete who had looked kind of butch even when she had been glammed up for the Olympics, and looked a hell of a lot more so now. Her coming out, though she had never formally done so, thus tended to reinforce existing stereotypes about female athletes. The commentary came from millions of idiots on the internet, and the drama occurred in Tekla's relationships with the other Russians, who constituted a powerful bloc on the space station. This had faded as they'd gotten used to it, as more people of various nationalities and sexualities had joined the Cloud Ark, and as everyone had focused their attentions on larger problems. But it had turned Tekla into a curious, solitary creature, socially distant from the only people with whom she could carry on a fluent conversation. The expectation among politically correct academic leftist observers had been that she would undergo a personal transformation and become like an academic leftist. But she seemed to have retained the same basic attitude about order and discipline that had made her a scout in the first place, and that had led her to putting Sean Probst in an arm lock and offering to choke him out. Sitting across the table from her, drinking her coffee and picking out her oatmeal, Moira idly wondered whether Tekla was aware of the fact that there was a whole genre of internet fan pornography devoted to imaginary couplings, more or less sadomasochistic, between her and Sean Probst. In any case, Tekla's tendency to occasionally sit with Moira during breakfast seemed like, if not a direct invitation, then at least a preliminary gambit. Preoccupied with such thoughts, Moira was oblivious at first to the fact that the farm was suddenly crowded with people looking at the big situational awareness monitor above the end of the table where she and Tekla were having their breakfast. The viewing angle was awkward, and so she had to change her position to get a good look. It was a news channel showing scraps of cell phone video that had been spliced together to approximate a story. At the beginning of the story, the People's Justice Blockade was riding at anchor in the waters between the beach and Devil's Island, just beginning to catch the pink light of dawn. At the end of the story, the sun was shining on the churned slurry of crushed hulls and floating corpses visible through gaps between dreadlocks of smoke. In the middle were glimpses of black motes droning in from the sea and fantastic bubbles of flame spreading to envelop vast areas before they burst and disappeared, leaving behind wreckage that looked like it had been beaten with sledgehammers and doused with napalm. From there, the video would loop to sterile three-dimensional renderings of missile submarines and cruise missiles, and footage of the White House briefing room, where the president had made a short statement before turning matters over to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Other world leaders were chiming in from Downing Street, the Kremlin, Berlin, all of which was pretty compelling in and of itself until, just at the moment when Moira was going to look away to her oatmeal, something bright caught her eye on the screen, and she looked back to see video of a mushroom cloud rising over an ocean. "Did I miss something?" Moira asked. "That didn't look like a meteorite strike." "Nuke," Tekla said. Moira looked at her. Tekla's gaze, which some found chilly, was fixed on Moira's face. Moira didn't find it chilly at all. Tekla, for once, glanced away shyly. "Venezuela," she added. "Navy is no longer a problem. Rockets are launched again." She shrugged. She was wearing a tank top. Moira couldn't stop looking at her deltoids. She had to stop doing that. "On the beach, it was fuel-air bombs," Tekla continued. "Extremely destructive." Tekla leaned back in her chair and draped an arm casually over the back of the empty chair next to her. "What is your opinion, Dr. Crew?" "Please, call me Moira." "Sorry. Russian formality." Tekla was, maybe, cagier than she looked. She anticipated that someone like Dr. Crew would be horrified by the fact that we were now nuking people. She wanted to get it out in the open right away, while it was still fresh. Lost in contemplation of the structure of Tekla's arm, Moira was startled when a large, strongly built man slammed down into the chair next to her. She looked over to see that it was Marcus Luker. He placed a cup of coffee on the table in front of him and contemplated it for a moment, almost pointedly not looking at the video screens with their infinite, multi-angled replays of mushroom clouds and briefing rooms. Then he turned and looked at Moira, greeting her with raised eyebrows and a nod, and then giving Tekla the same treatment. So Moira was absolved from having to answer Tekla's question. Marcus answered it, even though no one had asked him. I know that I am at somewhat of a disadvantage here because I am a speaker of German, and so there is certain baggage. So, yes, the baggage is acknowledged. I see the awkwardness of it, the delicacy, but... Did you know it was going to happen? Moira asked him. No, it comes as a complete surprise to me. Moira nodded. But, had they asked for my opinion, I would have said yes. Marcus said. They are all going to die anyway, Tekla said, nodding. It struck Moira, just then, that Marcus and Tekla were quite comfortable with each other. It made sense. Marcus would not be the least bit troubled by Tekla's sexuality. On the contrary, it would make things much simpler for a man like him if he knew she were unavailable. He was an ex-military pilot, so was she. Naturally, they would tend to view certain things in the same way. For a while, during the Cloud Ark's first year, Tekla had been a sort of itinerant laborer. It might seem strange that a space station could support a person with no particular job, but none of the scouts had really been expected to survive, so none of them had been sent up with long-term roles in mind. Her alienation from the Russians who took the brunt of the spacewalking work had led her to try her hand at a number of different tasks. She knew the interior of Izzy as well as anyone, but she also knew how to operate the controls of an arklet, and she could put on a spacesuit and go out and weld things in space. Her period of wandering in the wilderness seemed to have ended when Marcus had taken over. Moira was no longer precisely certain what it was that Tekla did for a living, but she now had the clear sense that Tekla was working for Marcus directly, that he was trusting her to do something. "They're all going to die, yes," said another voice, "but we're not." It was Louisa. She came up behind Tekla and wordlessly asked permission to use the chair on which the Russian had draped her arm. Tekla not only gave it, but rose to her feet and pulled the chair out as a courtesy. "We're not all going to die, or at least that's what I'm hoping," Louisa went on. "And we have all just seen this happen. It's in our memories now, and not just that, but in a few hours we'll be taking deliveries from Kuru, reaping the benefits of having used fuel-air explosives and nuclear weapons against people who were basically defenseless. It's in our DNA now." Her eyes flicked toward Moira. "If you'll pardon the poetic imagery, Dr. Crew." Moira gave her a little smile and nodded. Marcus said, "So, do you disagree with it?" "No," Louisa said. "Let's be clear, Marcus. I have baggage too. I'm a brown Spanish speaker from South America. I devoted years of my life to hanging out with refugees on boats, and I'm a Jew. That's my baggage, okay?" "Understood," Marcus said. "I'm not down there. I don't know what advice JBF was getting, what she knew that we don't." "So, what is your point?" Marcus asked, crisply but politely. "We have no laws, no rights, no constitution, no legal system, no police." Marcus and Tekla looked at each other across the table. It was not a sneaky look, or a guilty look, or a conniving look, but it was a significant look. "It is being worked on," Marcus said. He wasn't kidding. Ever since the Crater Lake Accord had been signed, a whole think tank full of constitutional scholars had been toiling away on it in The Hague, and one of them was now resident up here. "I know it is," Louisa answered, "and it is very important to me that atrocities such as what we're seeing on these screens don't somehow infect that process. This cannot be business as usual." Marcus and Tekla, still looking at each other, seemed to arrive at a mutual decision to say nothing. Moira's phone vibrated. Looking at its screen, she saw that she had an appointment in 15 minutes. She excused herself from what had become a very strange coffee clutch. Oh well, perhaps it had cured her of some sentimental ideas. She had walked in aspiring to somehow recreate the experience of breakfasting in a sidewalk cafe in Europe, and instead been treated to half an hour of nuclear warfare mass incineration of protesters, and serious ethical discourse mixed in with a suddenly keen sexual tension between her and Tekla. Like quite a few other people on the Cloud Ark, she hadn't had sex since she had come up here. Many whose consciences were unencumbered by the existence of doomed spouses or fiancés on the ground had figured out a way to make it happen, but many others were not getting any. This couldn't possibly last. A couple of docked capsules had been set aside for conjugal visits, and everyone knew of quiet places around the space station where you could do it. Moira didn't have anyone down on the ground. She had abstained for lack of anyone up here, and just because it was the least sexy place you could possibly imagine. But it was starting to get to her. One of the items on her long-term to-do list, actually, was to come up with a policy for how to handle pregnancy aboard the Cloud Ark. Since pregnant people weren't fundamentally that different from those who weren't, what that really boiled down to was how to handle babies. The assumption, made by the architects, was that this was going to be an orderly process, and that anyone who got pregnant would do so with the intent of having the embryo frozen so that it could be implanted later when conditions were better for raising little ones. Having now spent the better part of a year up here, Moira doubted this. The architects were, she felt, underestimating the cultural difference between the general population and the Arkies. Until a few months ago, they had been referred to as Arkers, and in all official communications still were. Then someone had coined the term Arkies, and in one of those only-on-the-internet viral phenomena, it had swept across the planet in about 24 hours and become universal. A few sensitive Arkansas historians had registered objections, but they had been steamrolled. The Arkies were just kids, and they had surprisingly little exposure to the G-pop. The arklets they lived in couldn't really change their positions in the swarm. Moving from one arklet to the next was nearly impossible. It was an epic journey in a spacesuit, requiring some fancy tricks with orbital mechanics. Small utility spacecraft, called flivvers, were available to squire people around, but there were only so many of them, and qualified pilots were few. Marcus, following suggestions from Louisa, had tried to make up for this by stirring the pot, meaning that about 10% of the Arkies at any given time were living and working aboard Izzy. But most of the time, most of them were stranded in individual arcs or in triads or heptads, their only connection to the general population being through video conferencing, Skype, social media, Spacebook, and other tech that had been transplanted from the earthbound world. Moira would be astonished if some girls weren't pregnant already, but no one had approached her about getting an embryo frozen, and any normal person who followed Moira forward through Zvezda and down into the cold storage facility would understand why. There was nothing about this place that tickled the nerve endings that mattered to people who wanted to start families. It was clinical industrial to a degree that was almost laughable. But by the same token, she hoped it would seem impressive to the new arrivals, who showed up right on time for their appointment. They had arrived several hours ago on a passenger capsule launched from Cape Canaveral, long enough for their anti-nausea meds to kick in and for them to pull themselves together a little bit. It was a small contingent from the Philippines. A scientist who had been working on genetically modified strains of rice, a sociologist who had been working with Filipino sailors who spent their whole lives on cargo freighters, she'd be working with Louisa, presumably, and a pair of Arkies who, judging from looks, were from ethnic groups as different as Icelanders were from Sicilians. One of them was carrying the inevitable beer cooler. As Moira knew perfectly well, for she did this at least once a day, it contained sperm, ova, and embryos collected from donors scattered around the country of origin, in this case, the Philippines. She accepted it with due ceremony, like a Japanese businessman taking another's business card, and flipped the lid open for inspection. A few chunks of dry ice were still visible on the bottom. Good. The finger-sized vials were all contained within a hexagonal cage. She sampled some of them with a pistol-shaped infrared thermometer and verified that none of them had thawed out. Then, after putting on some cotton gloves to protect her skin from the cold, she pulled a few out and spot-checked them just to verify that they had been sealed, labeled, and barcoded in accordance with the procedures specified in the third technical supplement to the Crater Lake Accord, Volume 3, Section 4, Paragraph 11. They had. She'd have expected nothing less from Dr. Miguel Andrada, the geneticist. She also guessed that Dr. Andrada suspected, at some level, that none of these samples had a snowball's chance in hell of ever developing into sentient life forms. But this was not a subject to talk about now. For the benefit of the others, Moira gave a little canned speech, trying to make it sound spontaneous, thanking them, and by extension, the people of the Philippines for having entrusted her and the Cloud Ark with these most precious contributions, and hinting, without promising, at a future in which a cornucopia of vibrant humanity would spring forth from each little plastic vial. It was expected that these people would go forth now to their arklets and text or Facebook the news down to their friends and family at home. The promise in those words was meant to keep people on Earth from getting too rambunctious while they waited for the end. And if that failed, as it had in the case of Venezuela, well, JBF could just nuke them. "May I see how it all works?" Dr. Andrada asked, after the rest of his delegation had been sent on their way. So it was just the two of them now, hovering in a long, slim docking module that projected to the nadir side. Below them, its far end was sealed off by a hatch with a keypad. Most of Izzy was open to anyone who wanted to wander in and poke around. They didn't get a lot of riffraff. But the HGA, the Human Genetic Archive, had a kind of quasi-sacred status, and was kept under the digital equivalent of lock and key. Dr. Andrada was a small, wiry man with prominent cheekbones. Like some other ag geneticists Moira had known, he had a calloused, tanned, leathery look, the result of spending a lot of time in experimental plots, digging in actual dirt. Except for a nice pair of eyeglasses, he could have passed for a farmer anywhere in Southeast Asia. But he had a PhD from UC Davis and had been on the fast track for a Nobel Prize before the agent had intervened. "Of course," Moira said. "I'd fancy a chat, anyway, about how we're going to grow things other than humans up here." "We need to talk about that," Dr. Andrada agreed. She drifted down, performing a slow somersault so that she could address the keypad, and punched the button that turned on the iris scanner. After a few moments, the device agreed that she was Dr. Moira Crew and unlocked the hatch. Bracing herself with a handle on the wall, she pulled it open, then allowed herself to drift through into the docking module beyond. There was barely room in this for both her and Dr. Andrada. White LEDs came on automatically. Clipped to the wall was a simple nylon web belt with a few small electronic gadgets holstered in it. Moira took this and buckled it around her waist. They had entered through the hatch on the module's zenith side. To port and starboard were openings that had been sealed off by round plastic shields. Each of these had a handle projecting from its center. The closest to Moira was the one on the port side, so she grabbed the handle, squeezed it to release a latch, and then pulled it out of the way. Dr. Andrada flinched at the frigid air that washed into the space in its wake. They were looking down a straight tube about 10 meters long, large enough for one person to work comfortably, or for two to pass each other if they didn't mind bumping bodies. Its walls were studded with long, neat rows of smaller hatches about as wide as a splayed human hand, each with its own little handle. Hundreds of them. Closer to the entrance, these bore neat, machine-printed labels and barcodes. Farther away, they were blank. Next to each one of them was a blue LED. These provided the space's only illumination. "Would you like to do the honors?" Moira said. "If I don't freeze to death first," Dr. Andrada said. Space is cold, Moira said. We rely on that. She gave him a minute to put on the cotton gloves, then opened the cooler and held it out. He removed the little rack containing the samples. Moira zapped its barcode with a handheld scanner from her belt. Dr. Andrada pulled himself into the cold storage module and began to drift deeper into it, gingerly prodding the walls in a way that marked him out as a new arrival to zero gravity. "Take the first one that's unlabeled," Moira said. "Leave the door open, please." Dr. Andrada coughed as the chilly air made his throat spasm. He opened one of the small hatches and slid the sample rack into it. In the meantime, Moira was using a handheld printer to generate a sticker identifying the sample in English, in Filipino, and in a machine-readable barcode language. Once Dr. Andrada had returned to the central module, she went up to the open hatch, verified that the sample rack was properly seated in the tubular cavity beyond, then closed the hatch and affixed the sticker to its front. Printed on the hatch was a unique identification number and a barcode conveying the same thing, which she zapped and then double-checked. The LED next to this hatch had turned red, signaling that the compartment's temperature was too high. While Moira checked her work, it turned yellow, which suggested the cold was soaking in. Later, she'd pull it up on the screen of her tablet and verify that it had gone blue. She flew back out to the docking module and grabbed the round shield that sealed off the cold store. "Now you know what these are for," she said. "Thermal insulation." She snapped the shield back into place. "I could open the other one," she offered, "but you would see the same thing." "Thank you anyway," said Dr. Andrada, "but I have never been so cold in my life." They went back up to Zvezda, and then proceeded forward to the complex of modules where most of the genetic engineering gear was stored. There was nothing to see here but boxes. They could just as easily have gone aft to one of the tori, but Moira knew from experience that new arrivals didn't benefit from switching back and forth between zero-G and simulated gravity. Through the nice eyeglasses, Dr. Andrada was giving Moira a look that she read as polite but skeptical. Fair enough. She decided to broach what was probably on his mind. "Forgive me that bit of ceremony," she said. "I've done it once or twice a day for a year. I'm as much priestess as scientist. You're meant to blog it, of course, to tell the people down below that you personally hand-carried the samples all the way from Manila to a cold storage location on Izzy." "Yes, I understand that. I will do so." He paused, signaling a change in topic. "It is not exactly decentralized." Moira nodded. "If that thing gets hit with a rock 10 minutes from now, all of the samples are destroyed." "Yes, that is my concern." "Mine as well. It all boils down to statistics and mathematics. For now, there aren't that many rocks, and we can see them and avoid them if necessary. Keeping all the eggs in one basket." "And sperm," Dr. Andrada said, in what had become the oldest joke in Moira's personal universe, "is actually a safer bet, for the next couple of weeks, than trying to distribute them among all of those arklets. But there is a plan, Dr. Andrada, for so distributing them, which will be triggered when the BFR breaks through a certain threshold." He nodded. "Please, call me Miguel." "Miguel. Moira, if you would." "Yes. Now, you know why I was chosen to come up here." "You figured out a way to make photosynthesis in rice more efficient by transplanting genes from maize. Greenpeace destroyed your research facility in the Philippines, but you kept the project alive anyway in Singapore. Starting shortly after zero, you began developing strains of that rice adapted for cultivation in low-G hydroponic environments." "Sprice," Miguel said, with an ever-so-slight roll of the eyes. The term, a contraction of space rice, had been coined by an enthusiastic reporter for the Straits Times and become an unkillable staple of tabloid headlines and internet comment threads. Do you understand, Moira, that it cannot grow without some amount of simulated gravity? There has to be an up and a down, or the root system cannot develop. In this, it is more difficult than algae, which doesn't care. Oh, we're all going to be eating algae for a long time, Moira said. Sprice will come later, after we have constructed more environments that rotate to make gravity. And then, Miguel, then what? Miguel asked. Sprue. Sprue? Space brew, Moira said. It's not as good as barley, but you can make beer from rice in a pinch. Tap, Marcus said. He had to say it because he couldn't do it. The traditional way for a wrestler to tell his training partner that an unbreakable submission hold had been achieved was by tapping him or her on the hand, arm, leg, or whatever could be reached. But Marcus couldn't reach anything. Tekla had both of his arms controlled. She let go of him moments before they drifted into the padded wall of the circus. A large, mostly empty module reserved for exercise, and they raised their hands to absorb the impact. Watching interestedly from the far side of the circus were June Ueda, an engineer named Tom Van Meter, Bowler Erdena, and Vyacheslav Dubsky. The three men were taciturn. Bowler Erdena, who was nothing if not enthusiastic, permitted herself 3 claps, then stopped when it became clear that no one else was joining in. Okay, Vyacheslav said. Seeing is believing. It is possible to perform sambo in 0 gravity. His eyes flicked in the direction of the others. Or jiu-jitsu, or wrestling, or bok, I presume. Obviously, there are no throws. None of that shifting of the weight that is so important on the ground, Marcus said. June nodded. It is a subset, a little bit like ground fighting, but without the ground. Tom Van Meter, who'd been a collegiate wrestler en route to an engineering degree at Iowa, turned himself around to face the padded wall, then tried delivering a punch. In spite of his considerable size and strength, it landed weakly and sent him drifting backward across the module. We experimented with that too, Marcus said. Punches are problematic. Just before striking the opposite wall, Tom flung both arms outward and slapped the mat to absorb energy. If you're in a Taurus or a Bolo, all the usual stuff is going to work, he said. But you're right. Martial arts in 0G is a new frontier. Once you have come to grapple, Tekla said, not so different. The Cloud Ark is equipped with 12 tasers, Marcus said. I did not request these. They were here when I arrived. No one knows about them. I am not comfortable with having some persons go around with sidearms, even if they are just tasers, while everyone else is unarmed. And yet, we have a population of 2,000 or so. There is no town on Earth of such a population that does not have police. There will be crimes, disputes. What does the Constitution say about police? Bowler Erdena asked. I haven't read it. All of the others laughed, appreciating her. No one has read the bloody thing, Bo. It is this thick when you print it out, Marcus said, holding his thumb and index finger 2 inches apart. Written by committee, as you would expect. To be clear, Marcus, said June, you are not suggesting... No, June, I am not saying we ignore it. Believe me, I am screaming at these guys every day to make it simpler. To give us the, what do you call it? Cliff notes, Tom said. Yes, before we fall off the cliff. A simple owner's manual. But somewhere in there, a police force is mentioned. I grabbed it. They will have to be citizen police at first, no professionals. I have studied your personnel records. I know that you are all trained in some sort of wrestling. Wrestling is the only form of organized violence that is actually usable aboard a space station, short of absolutely crazy shit.
How about stick fighting?
Tom asked. I knew you would ask because your CV mentions a little bit of a screamer, Marcus said. It is a reasonable idea. I have a question, though.
Yes?
Do you see any sticks? Maybe we could grow some trees, Bo suggested. That will take a while, Marcus returned. And so, I am simply asking you this. To spend a little bit of time each day getting together in this module to practice wrestling. It might come in handy. Doob had slept so poorly he suspected he hadn't slept at all. But the clock said it was about .15. When he'd climbed into his sack, it had said .9. He must have dozed off for a while, but he didn't know when. His nightly video conference with Amelia hadn't gone well. It hadn't gone badly. They hadn't raised their voices or come to tears. But at first it had been all about what had just happened in Kuru, and after that there'd been a failure to connect. He'd noticed the same thing with Henry. They were running out of things to say to each other. That was ghastly, but it was true. His family members were all preparing to meet their maker in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. The government had been handing out free euthanasia pills to anyone who wanted them. Thousands had already swallowed them, and bodies overflowed the morgues. Mass graves were being dug with front-end loaders. Meanwhile, Doob was preparing for, to be blunt, to be honest, the greatest adventure of his life. He wished, at some level, that they were already dead. He had spoken those seemingly unspeakable words to Louisa several days ago, and she had nodded. Happens all the time, she said, with caregivers of terminal Alzheimer's patients or similar cases. An enormous sense of shame and guilt comes with it.
But Amelia doesn't have Alzheimer's. She's...
Doesn't matter. Seeing her, talking to her, makes you feel bad. And at some level, your brain wants the thing that makes you feel bad to go away. Simplest reaction in the world. Doesn't make you a bad person. Doesn't mean you have to give in to it. Those thoughts had led to more tossing and turning, if those were the right words for not being able to sleep in a loose sack in zero gravity. As he had wrestled with the question of when. Predicting it on day 720, plus or minus a few, had been all well and good back on day 360, but day 700 was now approaching its end, and the plus or minus thing was seriously bothering him. Lately they'd narrowed it down to plus or minus 3 days, but that was in response to political pressure. It wasn't a legit scientific move, and it meant something different to scientists. Laypersons understood it as certainly between 717 and 723. Scientists would instead say that if you could repeat the experiment of blowing up the moon a large number of times and keep track of the time to white sky separately in each case, the numbers would fall into a normal distribution, a bell-shaped curve, with about 2/3 of the instances falling within that range, which meant that the remainder would fall outside of that range, and some would fall well outside of it. It was not out of the question that it could happen tomorrow, that it could be happening right now, while Doob floated in a goddamn sack. So when Dinah came and woke him up just after .15, he wasn't angry at her, more relieved. Basic politeness prevented him from saying so, but she looked a wreck. Not in the sense of being over-the-top emotional, just drained and beat up. You know about Guyana? She asked him over her shoulder as they wended their way back to the mining colony.
Yeah.
Okay. She said nothing further until they were in her shop. Doob could see the wreckage of old-school communication all over the place. Many sheets of paper taped to the available surfaces, dull pencils drifting around, loose pages from the employee manual with blocks of characters crossed out. "I had to tell Sean to knock it off," she admitted. "I'm used up. Can't do it anymore. Need to get some sleep. This shit is difficult. You have to be precise. Keying slow enough for Sean to copy the transmission is like walking slow."
"Walking slow?"
"You know," Dinah said. "Anyone can walk at a normal pace. That's easy. But when you have to walk at half speed, like because you're accompanying someone who has trouble getting around, it's exhausting."
"Got it."
When I started to beg off, he changed his topic. To that point, it was all, "Hey, what's going on? How many people are on the Ark?" But when I applied a little time pressure, he started talking about sensitivity analysis. Doob laughed. "Wow," Dinah said, looking at him keenly. "Not the reaction I expected."
"I've been awake for hours thinking about it,"
Doob said. "So you know what he means? Because I'm just a dumb clodhopper. I had to ask him."
"I assume he means, how certain are we really that it's going to happen on day 720? And just how unstable is the system?"
"Yep, that's what he means."
"The closer we get, the more it's like a nuclear reactor about to go critical, or, well—"
"Pick your metaphor, I get it," Dinah said.
"Anything that's that unstable can be set off by random noise in the system. Things that we inherently cannot predict. Pretty soon it's going to be so on edge that just looking at it funny will set it off. We just don't know which rock is going to trigger the avalanche."
Dinah considered it for a few moments, then broke eye contact and looked at her radio. "Sean does," she said.
"I'm not sure I heard that correctly,"
Doob said, after a long, groping pause. "The 8-ball," she said. "That's what Sean calls it. It's a rock you don't know about, one you can't see coming. It's too dark, too far away."
"Dinah, I'm confused. Are we talking about a hypothetical asteroid here, or—"
"No, a specific one. A real one. Look, Doob, you know that Arjuna Expeditions has been putting up CubeSats for years. We have hundreds of eyes in the sky, drifting around taking pictures of near-Earth asteroids, cataloging them, recording their orbital parameters with as much precision as we can manage. Well, apparently he's been lying awake at night, thinking about the same stuff as you. The extreme instability of the debris cloud. Its sensitivity to any kind of perturbation. And he had the bright idea. Why not search through Arjuna's secret database of asteroids to see whether any bad actors were going to be passing through the middle of the lunar debris cloud during the next couple of weeks, when it's on such a hair trigger?"
"He has that database with him?"
"Sure, whatever. It's just a spreadsheet."
"So he opened that spreadsheet and did that analysis?"
"Yeah. Doob, listen, I'm piecing this together from circumstantial evidence. You've seen how spotty the communication is."
"Understood."
"But I think he did that analysis and found an asteroid which he is calling the 8-ball. I assume it's low albedo."
"Black, as 8-balls are,"
Doob said. "I don't know anything about its size or its orbital parameters or any of that. But Sean thinks it's going to pass right through the middle of the cloud in about 6 hours.
6 hours?
And that it has enough kinetic energy to be, well, interesting." Doob was thinking about Amelia, about those emotions that had kept him awake earlier. Predictably, everything had now been reversed, and he was terrified that she and Henry and Hesper and Hadley were all about to die. Dinah misinterpreted this as him making astronomical calculations in his head. "I'm going to go and get 6 hours of sleep," she said. "Good night."
"Good night, Dinah,"
Doob said. It was about .16. shift change time, the equivalent of 4 in the afternoon for third shifters. So Marcus was approaching the end of what, for any normal Earthbound person, would be his workday. Of course, like almost everyone else in the Cloud Ark, he worked the whole time he was awake. Even his recreational activities, such as martial arts practice in the circus, had a larger purpose. So the afternoon shift change and the end of his workday were purely formal observances. Nevertheless, he was in the habit of using this time of day for dealing with what used to be called paperwork. And as part of that, he had invited to his little private office off of the tank the only lawyer in space, Salvatore Guardian. Son of a Singaporean Chinese father and an Italian countess, whose parents had gone to that city-state as tax exiles. He had been educated in a school for mostly British expats, matriculated at Berkeley, dropped out after 1.5 years to join a tech startup, lost his shirt, bummed around to various other startups, finally made some money, become interested in the law, essentially bought his way into law school despite not having a bachelor's degree, worked for 15 years at the Los Angeles, Singapore, Sydney, Beijing, London, and Dubai offices of a white shoe law firm, been passed over for partnership, resigned, ridden his bicycle across China, moved to San Francisco, and become the general counsel of a digital currency trading firm while in his spare time volunteering for a nonprofit cyber rights organization and going out into the desert to launch very large homebrew rockets to the edge of space. Sal, as he was universally known, had been one of the first people chosen to work on the constitution of the Cloud Ark, and so had spent a 1.5 years at The Hague before getting yanked, as the expression went, and launched up here. He was 47 years old, but in dim light could have passed for 30. As a way to deal with the exigencies of zero-G life and a surrender to a receding hairline, he had taken to wearing a short vacubuzz. This was the easiest thing to do with hair in space. The vacubuzzer was a machine that combined the functions of an electric trimmer and an industrial shop vac. Haircuts were self-serve and consumed about 30 seconds if you were unusually fastidious. Earplugs were recommended. In his halcyon days, Sal had sported a luxuriant head of long, wavy black hair and a widow's peak that brought out his Italian heritage. But with a vacubuzz, he looked almost purely Chinese. He spoke 7 languages, and he came closer than any living human to having the entire Cloud Ark Constitution, or CAC as he called it, in his brain. If Marcus had anything to say about it, which he did, then Sal would very soon combine in one person the functions of Attorney General, Head Prosecutor, Justice of the Peace, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Sal laughed. He had great teeth.
You realize that those roles are completely incompatible. They're intended to be one another's mutual adversaries in a lot of ways.
Then you can appoint other people to fill them. Look, Sal, we are talking about a bootstrapping process. We have to start somewhere.
Let's wargame it, Sal said. A male Archie from outer Bazaristan rapes a female Archie from Andorra. It happens in a place where we don't have any cameras.
There are very few such places, Marcus pointed out.
Okay, fine. It happens in an Arklet, or so the victim claims. She goes to sickbay, where medical evidence is gathered.
Do we even have rape kits? Marcus asked.
How should I know? Sal returned. But we should get some. Anyway, based on that, in some countries, a judge might issue a warrant enabling the police to look at the video records from that Arklet. Because in some countries, Marcus, people have a right to privacy and you can't just be surveilling them all the time.
And what is the situation here?
It's fascinating that you don't even know, but I'll tell you that the CAC recognizes certain rights that, however, may be abrogated or curtailed during periods of simplified administrative procedures and structures.
PSAPs. Marcus said. That I know about. It is a euphemism for martial law.
Sal looked somewhere between pained and amused.
May I suggest you stop thinking about it that way, or, failing that, never say it out loud. But, nevertheless, a better analogy might be the authority a captain wields over a ship at sea. The captain can do things like preside over marriage ceremonies or order someone confined to quarters that would not be acceptable if the same ship were tied up to a pier in Manhattan. Look, I do not have time now to wargame a whole prosecution of a hypothetical rape,
Marcus said, glancing at his wristwatch. Swiss, naturally, and made specifically for him by a famous Geneva company, as a sort of legacy, a way of saying, we existed once, and here is what magnificent things we were capable of.
I want to talk about something very basic, very fundamental, which is, how do I have authority? Or, if I am replaced by Ivy or Ulrika, how does she have authority?
Sal didn't quite see where he was going.
Authority meaning...
When this elicited no response other than impatient muttering, Sal tried,
Authority can mean many different things, Marcus. In this case, I am not speaking of moral authority or leadership qualities or any of that stuff. I do not mean the theoretical loyalty that Archies have to the so-called captain of the ship. I mean, what happens if we go to arrest the rapist from Outer Bazaristan and he decides to put up a fight, and his friends decide that they are going to fight with him?
Sal, to this point, had been viewing the conversation as an enjoyable exercise in legal theory. He now looked more serious.
You're talking about power, what it really means, what it really is. Yes. It's an old question. A pharaoh, a medieval king, the mayor of New York City, they all have to think about the same thing. Yes, Marcus said again. When you give an order, what assurance do you have that it will be carried out? That is the essential question of power. Jawohl, Counselor. Normally, here I would speak to you about moral authority and loyalty and all of that, but you have already ruled this out. When push comes to shove, as the English expression has it, the traditional answer has always been that the king has his guard, the mayor his chief of police, the commander his military police or what have you, and it is their ability to physically coerce others that is the ultimate foundation of the leader's power. Now you're talking. And what is that for me, under the CAC? You understand, Sal said, that the more you actually call upon such persons to coerce, the less power you have in a way. It is an admission of failure. Sal, Marcus said, how long have you been up here? 200 and some days. How many hours have we spent talking about the CAC? I have no idea. Probably 100 hours over that time. And of that, how much time have we spent talking about this one thing?
Sal checked his own watch.
Maybe 15 minutes. So, based on that allocation of time, Marcus said, maybe you can see that this is not all that important to me in the big scheme of things. But it is important, Sal. When the moment comes when I have to arrest a criminal who is being protected by his comrades, I must have an answer. I must know what to do. I must be prepared. This is what I do. This is why I have this job.
Someone was knocking on the door to Marcus's office, which was unusual. Marcus ignored it for now.
Under PSAPs, you can deputize specific people to enforce your decisions using appropriate levels of physical coercion. Once we get out of PSAPs, how soon do you think that is going to happen?
Marcus's tone of voice suggested that he had his own opinions on the matter.
If we are lucky enough to survive, it will be years, Sal said. So, we must confine ourselves to PSAPs for this discussion, Marcus said.
Then he hollered at the door,
Just a minute!
Then back to Sal.
Appropriate levels of physical coercion. What does that mean? Who decides?
Well, Sal said, if you make me Attorney General, Head Prosecutor, Justice of the Peace, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I guess I do.
If someone gets tased and his heart stops and he dies, is that appropriate?
Jesus Christ, Marcus. What has gotten into you?
I am wargaming, Marcus said, trying to be prepared. You should do it too, not with hypothetical rape cases, but with what is likely to start happening soon.
He held Sal's gaze until Sal answered with a nod. Then he aimed his voice at the door.
All right, come in.
Door was a landlubber term for what, on a boat or a spaceship, would be called a hatch. A convention had developed where, in a part of Izzy that had simulated gravity, it was referred to as a door. In the floaty bits, it was called a hatch. The door opened to reveal Dubois Jerome Xavier Harris. The look on his face, combined with the mere fact that he had interrupted Marcus during a meeting in his private office, suggested that something serious was happening. Marcus's mind jumped straight to the most obvious explanation.
Is the president nuking people again?
Dr. Harris looked startled by the suggestion, then shook it off. No, it wasn't that.
Does this meeting require privacy?
Marcus asked, with a look at Sal. Sal stood, volunteering to make himself scarce. But Dr. Harris just got a bemused look.
It concerns the least private thing that ever happened, or ever will, he said. So no thank you. I have reason to believe that the timetable has just been pushed up very significantly. There is a chance that the white sky could happen as soon as 6 hours from now.
He checked his watch.
Call it 5.
Marcus's eye flicked to a display on the wall.
I see no uptick in the BFR.
It will be triggered by the passage of an asteroid through the cloud.
Does anyone on the ground know?
It depends on to what extent this office is under surveillance.
So, your information does not come from the ground?
No. It comes from deep space.
Via encrypted Morse code?
Marcus inquired casually. He and Sal exchanged a look. Their conversation had begun an hour ago with reading a memo from JBF complaining about such transmissions and demanding that action be taken. It was in discussing how to take such action and whether the White House had any authority in the matter that Marcus and Sal had wandered into their more general discussion of power, which was how Marcus liked it, for now. Because if someone was sending mysterious encrypted Morse code transmissions from Izzy, it had to be his girlfriend. And he wasn't going to arrest her. People would howl about conflict of interest. People who would be dead soon. People who had no way to enforce their authority here. Unless they had planted, among the Archies or the general population, fifth columnists with orders to execute a coup d'etat if necessary.
Marcus,
Dr. Harris asked,
are you hearing me? Do you understand what I just said?
I beg your pardon, Dr. Harris. I just got distracted thinking about the kind of things that Sal is supposed to think about.
Feel free to delegate some of that, Sal said. I know it's not your strong suit, but—
Close the door, please,
Marcus said. Dr. Harris did.
I am reasonably sure of no surveillance in here.
Noted.
It is Dina, isn't it, Doob?
Marcus asked. Doob nodded.
She's talking to Sean Probst over an encrypted channel.
Marcus shook his head admiringly.
What a girl. My God, she is trouble.
Doob and Sal were silent. During their silence, Marcus thumbed out a one-word text message to Tekla.
Sal,
Marcus said,
I declare peace-ups.
I don't think we are yet authorized to—
Who is going to stop us?
Doob and Sal again were silent on the matter.
Is Julia, I do not call her the president anymore, going to nuke us?
He was continuing to thumb out messages as he talked.
She or the Russians or the Chinese might have other ways of removing you from your position.
I have thought about this, Marcus said, about the possibility that there are plans. Military guys with tasers or whatever, waiting for such an order. I have talked to Fyodor, to Sheng, to Zeke, trying to sound them out, to get a feel for it.
Marcus,
Doob said,
with respect, I don't think that this is what you ought to be focusing on right now.
Which is why I am delegating the constitutional side of it to Sal and the operational side of it to her.
Marcus nodded toward the door, which had swung open without a knock. Tekla glided through and closed it behind her.
We don't have to announce to the whole world that we are going to PSAPs. We have 5 hours in which to begin preparations quietly. I will contact Moira and tell her that we must begin preparations to disperse the genetic samples to the arklets. I will tell Ulrika that we must pull the trigger on the search.
By this, Marcus meant a long-planned burst of launches that was supposed to happen in the few days' grace period between the white sky and the onset of the hard rain.
We can be working on these things quietly. 5 hours from now, it will happen or it will not. If it does not, we go back to as we were and consider this a dress rehearsal.
The door opened again, this time after a knock, and in came a young man named Steve Lake, preceded by his laptop and followed by his dreadlocks. For Steve, in his year and a half aboard Izzy, had not succumbed to the vacuum buzzer's siren song, but he had gotten tired of messing with his long hair and had allowed it to congeal into red ropes. Formerly employed by a consulting firm in Northern Virginia that hired hackers to do secret work for intelligence agencies, he had been yanked and sent up to support Spencer Grindstaff, the networks and communications specialist who'd been one of Izzy's original crew on Zero. Spencer was an NSA man through and through, recruited straight out of MIT to work on spooky crypto stuff. Steve seemed to be an altogether different sort of character. He looked a bit mystified just now.
Steve, Marcus said, it is time for us to have a conversation about power.
Steve's brow furrowed. You mean electrical power or
the other kind?
Okay. And is this going to be like an abstract philosophical discussion or
no? It is going to conclude with me telling you, under my PSAP's authority, to change all of the passwords and keys for Izzy's control systems.
Wow, Steve said. Shouldn't you be talking to Spencer then? Because he's above me in the org chart.
I am familiar with the org chart, Marcus said. Under PSAPs, I have the authority to change it.
What is this PSAPs thing you keep talking about, Marcus?
Sal will explain it later. For now, we may set it aside. Fundamentally, we speak of your loyalty, your allegiance. I think that Spencer is extremely loyal to powers that be on the ground. I do not wish to put him in an impossible bind. He will later come with us, or he will not. You, I believe, to be a different kind of fellow. I ask you, in effect, to now become loyal to the Cloud Ark and the Cloud Ark alone. Not to Washington, not to Houston, and to accept the authority of whoever is the boss of the Cloud Ark, which for now is me.
Okay.
You're supposed to think about it first, Steve. Not just say okay.
I've been thinking about it for a while, but I have to tell you there might be back doors. I can change all the codes I know about. The ones I don't know about are a different matter. White sky. Doob couldn't guess how many times during his life he had noted a cottony tuft of cloud in a blue sky, then looked up hours later to discover that it had developed into a bank of clouds that covered the sun and told of a change in the weather. Such phenomena happened too slowly for the mind to discern them as happening at all. During the last hours of A plus 1.335, something like that occurred in the cloud of lunar debris that had been hanging in the sky for the last 700 days. Later they would watch the movies of it in time-lapse, compressing a day's changes into a minute of video, and it would look like an explosion. Or an epidemic of explosions. If you watched the video carefully enough, frame by frame, you could see it progress from one part of the cloud to the next as the 8-ball shot through. Like a particle lancing through a cloud chamber, it was invisible save for the trail of consequences it left in its wake. A few months earlier, it might have passed through without touching anything. But today, the density of rocks in the cloud was such that it could not avoid smashing into some of them on its way through. Doob, making a crude statistical calculation, put the likely number of collisions at 10, plus or minus 5. Not a large number in a cloud that now contained millions of rocks, but enough to push the system, trembling on the precipice of an exponential explosion over the edge. Around its unseen track, the white sky took form and fury. The cloud bloomed and evoluted like cream in coffee, spreading and paling, though from place to place one could see fresh bursts as rocks hurled out of earlier collisions found distant targets and touched off smaller chain reactions of their own. In places it took on a cellular structure as curved detonation fronts spread, contacted others, and merged into lacy foams of white arcs. It had an austere, monochromatic beauty about it. There was no fire and no light other than what cold sunlight the rocks bounced back to the eye. Later, when they began to enter the atmosphere, there would be fire and plenty of it. But for now the world was ending in a fractal blooming of dust and gravel, an apocalypse in a gravel quarry.
"You pretty much nailed it,"
someone told Doob,
"when you called it the white sky." "Being right does not always bring satisfaction,"
he said. The bolide fragmentation rate shot up through all meaningful thresholds within a few hours of the 8-ball's arrival, and Doob stopped paying attention to it. The number was probably wrong now. It was just an estimate, produced by a consortium of observatories based on the amount and distribution of light coming out of the cloud. All the assumptions that went into its calculation had now become obsolete. He tried aiming his optical telescope at where PP1 and PP2 and Cleft, the large, metal-rich children of Peach Pit, ought to be, but saw nothing except, possibly, some local highlights in the density of the cloud, perhaps caused by rocks dashing themselves to pieces on the steely surfaces of those dark bolides. He wondered if he would ever see them again. He no longer had an accurate visual memory of the size of the moon in the sky, and so he could not estimate how many times larger the cloud was. Of course, he could look those numbers up and calculate it, but he didn't really care what the numbers said. The full moon had always been the same size, but sometimes it looked huge and sometimes it looked small, depending on how close it was to the horizon, and on factors that were purely psychological or aesthetic. To all but a few of the people on the night side of Earth, looking up at the cloud, those factors were the only ones that mattered. He wanted to know how big it looked to them. He wanted to know how it felt. He wanted to see it over the Chino Hills from the courtyard of the Caltech Athenaeum, which was where he had last seen the moon, a few minutes before 0, and to know how it was to stand there on terra firma and to see it and to know it was death coming. Like most people, he had drawn up a list of everyone in the world he needed to say goodbye to, then gone through it and ruthlessly weeded out 90% of the names, since there wasn't time. And then, during his last few months on Earth, He had sought out and said goodbye to the ones he needed to see in person. From orbit, he had said goodbye to others on video conferencing links or with carefully written email messages. Once he had said goodbye to a given person, he avoided communicating with them again. It was awkward to go out for a last night of drinking with a colleague, reminisce and cry and hug and say farewell, and then find yourself emailing the same person 2 months later with a question about their latest observations. Consequently, his scope of acquaintances had steadily narrowed as he had worked his way down the list. By this point, he was down to his wife and his children. Reaching them became a lot more difficult after the 8-ball had done its work. The volume of communications between Izzy and the ground was limited by the total bandwidth of the station's antennas and radios. Personal communications had lower priority than operations, and operations were peaking as the final surge of launches was prepared, or, as Dinah called it, the splurge. Doob sent text messages to Amelia and the kids all the time. They sat in the delivery queue for minutes or hours, and half of them never got sent at all. Just when he was about to give up hope, he'd get a message back from Henry or Hadley or Hesper. Sending those messages and seeing the responses became more important than sleeping, so he broke shift, as the saying went, and dozed whenever he could, lying on the floor of the farm or just putting his head down on a table like a kindergarten kid, his phone right next to his face so he'd feel it jump when anything came through. It finally became clear to him, maybe 24 hours after he had given the news about the 8-ball to Marcus, that he was never going to communicate with his loved ones again, save through sporadic and unpredictable texts. Anything he needed to say to them directly, he ought to have said before, which should not have come as news. He had been telling himself for a long time that you had to act as if each conversation might be the last. This did not stop him from reviewing his final video chats with each one of them on the evening of day 700 and wishing he'd said certain things.
"How does it look from up there?"
Henry texted him. Doob checked the time. It was night in Moses Lake. He imagined Henry sitting out on that crappy old couch that they'd moved out of the house in Seattle, drinking a beer between work shifts, watching the white sky reach out for him like a spectral hand. Doob didn't know what to say.
"I think I'm seeing some spread along the orbital axis. The beginning of rings,"
he texted back. "I meant Earth," Henry returned. Doob went looking for a place where he could look down at Earth through a real window, not one of those damned situational awareness monitors. This ended up being the woo-woo pod. It was pretty crowded. Izzy was about to swing over the Terminator from day into night. Even over the brightly lit Pacific, they could see what looked like hairline scratches in the pellucid shell of the atmosphere, the white trails left by incoming bolides. Above the dark side of the Earth, these became arcs of blue fire that sometimes forked and sometimes ended in red bursts when they made it all the way to the ground. In other words, it looked the way it had looked the day before and the day before that. This level of meteorite activity would have been the most amazing astronomical event in human history had it happened suddenly 2 years ago. But beginning with the first big rock that had plowed into Peru just a few days after zero, the ambient level of bolide strikes had steadily crept upward. People had adjusted to it. Some had posted red-faced self-portraits after suffering bolide burn, meaning an acute case of sunburn caused by exposure to the ultraviolet light emitted by meteor trails in the nearby sky.
"Looking down at you now,"
Doob texted. He wanted to add,
"Wish I was there,"
but that would have been stupid.
"Looks like a big one coming in over southern BC."
"I see it," Henry returned, feeling its heat.
"Busy there?"
"You know it. Racking and stacking the big boys, getting ready for the surge. Doob wondered how it worked. What was to prevent desperate people from rushing the launch pads, trying to cram themselves aboard the last of those big boys? Like the last chopper out of Saigon, people dangling from the skids as soldiers punched them in the face. Or was he underestimating human nature? Maybe it was all perfectly orderly down there. "I need you here." That one was from Marcus. Reluctantly, Doob pushed himself away from the window and got turned toward the tube that would conduct him back to the stack. From there he would make his way back to T3, where Marcus was presumably hanging out in the tank. Marcus Luker was hovering directly in front of him, face illuminated by the blue light of a phone. He turned it off and slid it into his pocket. "I don't mean that I need you in the same room as he said. "I mean that I need your brain here, in space, on the Cloud Ark. Not down there. Your family is dead, Dr. Harris."
"Dead, but still talking,"
Doob said, feeling the start of a slow burn that might lead to him punching Marcus in the nose, if only he could get to a place with gravity.
"What is it you think they would like most to hear back from you?" Marcus asked. "Lovey-dovey stuff? They know you love them. Were I in their position, you know what I would like to hear? I would like to hear, 'Sorry, my darling, but I am very busy just now ensuring the survival of our species. May I suggest you text something in that vein and then join me in the tank? We have matters to discuss.'"
And Marcus Luker, using one of the ropes that were strung across the woo-woo pod as handholds, propelled himself toward the exit. As he passed through into the tube, Doob saw his silhouette against the circle of light, a Da Vinci man, just for a moment. Then two others swung in behind him and spoiled the effect. That detail caught his attention. Marcus now had an entourage, or perhaps a bodyguard. Hard rain. Like any good storm, the hard rain began with a sudden thunderclap. A kilometer-wide rock that lit up Eastern Europe with eerie, silent flashes as it skidded in across the upper atmosphere before digging into thick air somewhere around Odessa. Its trail set fire to dry leaves and combustible litter in the Crimea, then painted a long brushstroke of burning buildings and forests across the northeast rim of the Black Sea, ending with a long elliptical crater in the steppe between Krasnodar and Stavropol. The former city was first set on fire by radiant heat from the sky, and then flattened by a blast wave. The latter got only the blast, followed by a rain of ejecta. Both disappeared from human ken. After a few hours' respite, smaller bolides began to come down. They landed all over the world, but most often in the lower latitudes, close to the equator. Having been told long in advance that this would be the case, many people had moved toward the poles in recent months, prompting Rufus McQuarrie and his friends, family, and associates to establish a defensive perimeter around their works in the Brooks Range. That was a terrible place in November. The only refugees likely to make it up that far would be well-equipped and well-prepared, but those were exactly the kinds of uninvited visitors that Rufus didn't want creeping around. Unencumbered by the limits on bandwidth that applied to all the other radios in the Cloud Ark, Rufus and Dina had kept up their Morse code correspondence during the 3-day grace period between the white sky and the hard rain. Rufus was still transmitting from his truck, which he had parked before the entrance to the mine. He had considered erecting a larger antenna on the top of the mountain and hooking it up to an underground transmitter via armored cables. But Dina, after surveying the predicted effects of the hard rain, had told him not to waste his time. Ivy had said goodbye to the maternal organism several days earlier, immediately before the morgue had swallowed her government-issue euthanasia pill. The one person on Earth she was still in touch with was Cal, aboard his submarine, keeping station on the surface offshore of the Norfolk Naval Base, out where the water got blue enough to facilitate a deep dive when the time came. In those days, Ivy's main link to her family came through music. For the morgue had given 5-year-old Ivy a choice between becoming the best pianist in Southern California or the best violinist in Southern California, and Ivy had opted for the violin. She had never become the best in Southern California, or even close to it, but she had played in various youth orchestras and had developed some familiarity with the classical orchestral repertoire. She had a violin aboard Izzy, which she would tune up and play from time to time. When the bolide fragmentation rate shot up through a certain level on day 701, marking the formal beginning of the white sky, a number of cultural organizations launched programs that they had been planning since around the time of the Crater Lake announcement. Many of these were broadcast on shortwave radio, and so Ivy had her pick of programs from Notre Dame, Westminster Abbey, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, Tiananmen Square, the Potala Palace, the Great Pyramids, the Wailing Wall. After sampling all of them, she locked her radio dial on Notre Dame, where they were holding the vigil for the end of the world, and would continue doing so until the cathedral fell down in ruins upon the performers' heads and extinguished all life in the remains of the building. She couldn't watch it, since video bandwidth was scarce, but she could imagine it well. The Orchestre Philharmonique de Radio France. Its ranks swollen by the most prestigious musicians of the francophone world, all dressed in white tie and tails, ball gowns and tiaras, performing in shifts around the clock, playing a few secular classics, but emphasizing the sacred repertoire, masses and requiems. The music was marred by the occasional thud, which she took to be the sonic booms of incoming bolides. In most cases, the musicians played right through. Sometimes a singer would skip a beat. An especially big boom produced screams and howls of dismay from the audience, blended with the clank and clatter of shattered stained glass raining to the cathedral's stone floor. But for the most part, the music played sweetly, until it didn't. Then there was nothing. "Paris is gone," she texted. Through the military systems, which were patched in with NASA's, she could still communicate with Cal. "Dive. BBS," he answered, which by itself was pretty enigmatic, but she knew its meaning. The submarine had to dive below the surface for a while, to avoid some danger, but he expected he'd be back soon. But he might be wrong about that. She might never hear from him again. She decided it was long past time. She texted him a message that he would find waiting when and if his boat returned to the surface. "I release you from your vow." Then she felt a strange wave pass through her body, almost as if she were in a submarine in the Atlantic when a pressure wave rolled through from some distant meteor strike. She assumed it was an emotional reaction to what she had just done, but then she noticed that every loose floating object in her workspace was drifting in the same direction, toward the wall against which she had braced her back. Pops and creaks and groans propagated through Izzy. The space station was accelerating gently, at just a fraction of a G. The thrusters must be firing. The lights had turned red. The PA speaker in her module emitted a slight pop as it came on. "Alert," said a synthesized voice. "All personnel should now be awake and at stations for urgent swarm maneuver. This is not a drill." So it had happened. They had been practicing this for months, but this was the first real streaker alert. It meant that a bolide had been detected by SI, the sensor integration team, on an unusual trajectory that might pose a danger to Izzy unless the course was corrected slightly. Her first nervous impulse was to look out the window toward Amalthea. The big rock was still there. The maneuver hadn't caused it to snap off. But this was ship thinking, placing top priority on Izzy. She and everyone else needed to get in the mental groove of cloud thinking. The majority of the population lived on arklets. Izzy's purpose was to help the arklets survive. So she wrenched her gaze away from the window, an antiquated thing that, and brought up a display on her tablet showing the disposition of every vessel in the cloud arc. It was an app called Perambulator. It was not a literal rendering of what the cloud looked like, though you could make it show you that if you clicked the right menus. Perambulator was a tour de force of data visualization that would only make sense to people like Ivy, Doob, and most of the Archies, who had spent a lot of time learning about orbital mechanics. Starting with empirical observations from Lina Ferreira and other mathematically sophisticated biologists, mathematicians like Zhong Hu had extrapolated swarm algorithms from 3 to 6 dimensions, and physicists like Ivy had figured out how to make these algorithms work under the special constraints of orbital mechanics. In general, every vessel in the cloud was shown as a dot on a 3-dimensional scatter plot showing information about its orbit. 6 numbers, the orbital parameters, or as everyone up here had begun to call them, the params, were required to convey everything about an orbit. Only 3 could be visualized in any given plot, so that was where the user interface legerdemain came into play, and where someone like Ivy had to pay attention and engage all available brain cells. But the gist of it was that each arklet was a projectile that could strike Izzy or another arklet if its params were wrong. In a hypothetical, extremely simple cloud arc, consisting of only 2 arklets, only one calculation needed to be performed, namely, the calculation that answered the question, will arklet 1 bang into arklet 2 if both stay on their current courses? In a 3-arklet cloud, it was also necessary to figure out whether arklet 1 would collide with arklet 3, and whether 2 and 3 were going to collide. So that was a total of 3 calculations. If the cloud expanded to 4 arklets, 6 calculations were needed, and so on. In mathematical terms, these were known as triangular numbers, a kind of binomial coefficient. But the bottom line was that the number of calculations went up rapidly with the number of arklets in the cloud. For a 100-arklet cloud, it was 4,950 calculations. For a 1,000-arklet cloud, about 500,000. It would have flummoxed the simple computers of Apollo days, but was nothing by modern standards, provided that accurate information could be had about each arklet's orbit. An old-school centralized approach would have been for all the arklets to report their params to a computer on Izzy, which would then do all the calculations and report the results. The reliability of that process could be improved if Izzy's radars, observing the arklets and plotting their movements, filled in gaps in the data. And indeed, something like that was happening all the time, not just on one computer on Izzy, but on several. But this, again, was ship thinking. Cloud thinking dictated that each arklet make those observations and do those calculations separately. The computer on a single arklet, call it arklet X, might not have all the information needed to track every single one of the other arklets in the cloud, but it could identify the ones most likely to be a danger and focus on those. Others, as well as the central processors on Izzy, could assist it by sending messages to the effect of, "You might not be aware of it, but you are possibly in danger from arklet Y and might want to move it to the top of your list of things to keep an eye on." To which it might reply, "Thank you, but I'm not getting good params for arklet Y because Izzy is blocking my view on the radar." The cloud would then respond by, in some sense, becoming aware that arklets X and Y needed to know more about each other's params and giving a higher priority to making that happen. The cloud, in other words, became not just a physical cloud of flying objects in space, but a computational cloud as well, a free-floating, self-regulating internet. The function of Perambulator was to give its users an Olympian perspective on all that was happening in that network. And at some level, all you really needed to know about it was that scary things were shown in red. Ivy looked at it now, more in curiosity than in alarm, since they had been practicing maneuvers for weeks, and she thought she knew what to expect. Whenever Izzy fired her thrusters and changed her params, red propagated through the scatter plots like a drop of blood in a glass of water. All the free arklets, and all the ones connected to bolos or to heptads or triads, now needed to evaluate their params and see whether they were in danger of colliding with Izzy, or, almost as bad, of drifting away so far that they could never get back to the swarm, a condition shown by a yellow dot in the display. It was a simple matter for any given arklet to plot a new course that would avoid both of those fates. Much more complicated was for 300 arklets to do it at the same time without banging into each other. So a kind of negotiation had to take place, based not on awaiting commands from Izzy, but on observing what nearby arklets were doing and coordinating the firing of thrusters with them to minimize the amount of red showing up on the plot. It was necessary to place the word nearby in scare quotes, because it had a different meaning in this swarm than it did to a bird in a flock. To a bird, nearby meant just that. To things maneuvering in the six-dimensional parameter space of orbital mechanics, nearby meant any set of params that is potentially interesting to me in the next few minutes, and it could apply to objects that were currently too far away to be noticed. Once that was accounted for, however, the arklets could do as birds did when flying in flocks. In the simulations that they had seen shortly after the concept had been proposed, it had looked astonishingly like the behavior of schooling fish. And the reality of it, which had only been implemented in the last few months of around-the-clock launches from Kourou, Baikonur, Canaveral, et al., answered well to those simulations. It just happened more slowly in real time. It was happening now, in response to Izzy's course change. The red only spread so far, then began to recede, first fraying around the edges, then dying off in patches. A few dots went yellow, then corrected themselves as they caught up. Ivy's expectation, based on the last few months' tests and exercises, was that the last few red dots would turn white very soon and cease to be a concern. But this didn't happen. Some remained stubbornly red. Spinning the plot around, looking at it in various modes, she zeroed in on those dots and queried them. Almost all of them were cargo modules or passenger capsules that had been launched during the splurge, the last-minute effort made by all the spacefaring nations of the world to launch every last rocket they had capable of reaching orbit. Her phone buzzed. A message had come back from Cal. His boat must have resurfaced. What's that supposed to mean? He'd only just now seen her last text. It means we are no longer engaged. That seemed a little blunt, so she added, You need to find some nice mermaid. After a minute, he answered, Crying. I was going to do the same. Your odds considerably better. She answered, Bullcrap, which was an old joke between them. When she had first met him at Annapolis, he had been such a straight arrow that he was unable to speak the word bullshit. SAB equals straight arrow babe, came back. SAB is sad. Why did you dive? Big surface wave came through. Bad news for East Coast. Who tells you? Do you have a chain? Meaning chain of command. One rung left above me. Then, after a pause,
POTUS has gone dark.
She typed in, "Thank God for that," and hesitated before sending it. But the world was coming to an end. She didn't have to worry about repercussions. She hit send. She'd never talked to Cal about what had happened on day 700, the fuel-air devices, the nuclear warhead, but she was certain it had been his finger on the button.
May God have mercy on her soul.
Cal answered, and she knew the subtext, and may he have mercy on mine. This exchange of messages was interrupted by one from Marcus. "Need you." She pocketed the phone to free her hands for movement through Izzy, maneuvered through the maze of habitation modules to the stack, and headed aft, bound for the tank. The trip down the stack took no time at all. A week ago, she would have had to maneuver around people clumped in 2s and 3s for conversation. Since Marcus had declared PSAPs, this had changed. One of his edicts had been that this stack must be kept clear for rapid movement of essential personnel. Right now, it was as empty as she'd ever seen it. Down in the Zvezda module, she saw some comings and goings and recognized, for a moment, the spiky profile of Moira's hair. She would be busy making preparations to disperse the human genetic archive to the cloud, a project that, in and of itself, was at least as complicated as anything happening with swarms and params. Essential personnel indeed. Louisa popped into view down in H1 and propelled herself up the stack like she meant business. After nearly colliding with one of Moira's helpers, she let her momentum carry her up into Zarya, then stopped hard at the entrance to the tube that led to the woo-woo pod. She looked into it for a few moments, evaluating, then made a decision and pulled herself into it. Ivy passed by the same location a few moments later, slowed for a moment, and glanced down the length of the tube. It was possible to see straight down its length, across the spherical pod, and through its windows to the Earth. Normally, this meant the blue light of the oceans and the white light of clouds and ice caps. Sometimes a lot of green when they were passing over well-watered parts of the world, or some yellow when over the Sahara. Right now, the light was orange because the Earth was on fire. People were screaming down there in the pod. Louisa must have been sent there to calm people down. Ivy was almost drawn in by a sort of magnetic power of fascination. Earth looked as if some god had attacked it with a welder's torch, slashing away at it and leaving thin trails of incandescence. Some of these were red and steady, things burning on the ground. Others were blinding bluish-white and evanescent, trails drawn through the atmosphere by meteorites. She fancied she could almost feel the warmth radiating from the planet. Marcus needed her. She couldn't help the screaming people down in the pod. She turned her head aft and pushed on. Hovering in the entrance to the genetic storage modules, Moira was ticking off items on her tablet, listening dead-faced to something on a large pair of headphones. She noticed Ivy. She peeled a headphone away from one ear and aimed it at her. Ivy recognized a cappella music, medieval polyphony. "King's College is holding up rather well," she said. "Do you know the piece?" "I'm certain I've heard it before, but I can't place it," Ivy said. "Allegri's Miserere me Deus," Moira said. Thanks to the morgue's insistence that she take Latin, Ivy knew what it meant. "Have mercy on me, O God." "It's beautiful." "They would sing it at Tenebrae, in the wee hours, as they extinguished the candles one by one." "Thank you, Moira." "Thank you, Ivy." A minute later, she was in T3. As always, she stood flat-footed for a moment to get the feel of simulated gravity, then headed toward the farm and the tank. Passing through the utility section, she considered getting herself a cup of coffee. Then she felt shock and shame over the fact that she was thinking about coffee while her planet was being set on fire. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee anyway, and stepped into the farm. This was crowded. Most of the situational awareness monitors were showing status displays relating to the functions of the cloud arc. The big one at the head of the room was just showing a view of Earth through a camera aimed in that direction. But the video image had nothing like the impact of seeing it directly through the windows of the woo-woo pod. The arc light intensity of the streaking bolides was reduced to a blurry flare of maxed-out pixels. Out of habit, she wondered why they didn't change the channel to CNN or Al Jazeera, or one of the other full-time news networks. Then she remembered what was happening. She proceeded to the door that led into the tank. Flanking it was a pair of people who were doing nothing, just standing there. Odd. She noticed that both of them had unfamiliar devices slung from their belts. She realized that they were tasers. Before she could fully adjust to that, one of them, she recognized him now as Tom Van Meter, an engineer and sort of a jock, nodded politely, and opened the door for her. The tank was a quarter the size of the farm, just a medium-sized conference room with, at the moment, 6 people seated around the table working on tablets or laptops. At its far end was the door leading to Marcus's office. This was ajar. Ivy went through it, and for the first time since coming to Izzy 3 years earlier, she felt ill at ease doing so, as if someone might jump out and tase her. But Marcus was sitting there talking to Doob.
"Have you been watching Perambulator?"
Marcus asked her. Yes, after we made that course change a few minutes ago.
The performance of the cloud was not everything we could have hoped for.
There were some stragglers.
Still are,
Doob said, and drew her attention to a projection screen on the wall. It looked like they were all new arrivals, Ivy said. Cargo modules, passenger carriers from the splurge. I'm assuming they haven't logged onto the cloud yet, are not with the program.
That is all true, but it is dangerous nonetheless, Marcus said.
Of course it is.
It is distracting me.
I'll take care of it.
As far as bolides are concerned, the systems are working okay, and Doob is keeping an eye out for anomalies. But I need to delegate to you, Ivy, this problem of the stragglers.
Consider it done.
We will destroy them if we have to.
How would you even do that, Marcus? We don't have photon torpedoes.
We have a module full of freeze-dried dead people, Marcus reminded her, that we need to jettison anyway. And I would be happy to jettison it in the direction of any straggler that is threatening the cloud arc.
I will keep that in mind, Ivy said, as a bargaining chip. Louisa entered, looking a little wild, her face wet with tears.
Louisa, Marcus said politely, did you find out what was going on in the woo-woo pod?
A few people are getting very emotional, Louisa said, as you would expect. Nothing dangerous. Whoever called that in as a disturbance was being a little paranoid.
Thank you for investigating it.
Speaking of which, you have armed guards posted outside the door to the tank.
I will speak briefly to that because I am busy, Marcus said. My feelings about it are basically the same as yours. But I am not here to express my personal feelings, but to carry out certain operations to the best of my ability. I didn't want to be the king of the universe. Nevertheless, now I am. Everything I have ever seen in the history of human civilization, disagreeable as it might seem, says that someone in my position needs to have security.
Louisa's face suggested that she could make all kinds of objections to that, but she got the better of it and just let out a sigh. We will talk about it later, she said.
Good.
Do you know what is happening down there?
I can guess what is happening. It is none of my concern.
Understood. But I think that the king of the universe needs to make an announcement pretty soon.
I have one prepared,
Marcus said. Oh, yes, of course you would have one prepared. When were you thinking of delivering it? Because there are a lot of people who need to be calmed down.
Is one of those people you, Louisa?
Marcus asked the question clinically, but not unkindly. Louisa drew herself up. Ivy braced herself for a sharp reaction, but then a change came over Louisa's face as she saw that Marcus was merely asking for information, not being snide. Yes, she answered. A few minutes ago, Manhattan was struck by a 100-foot wall of water. I presume that the same is true of most of the East Coast. I was listening to the service from St. Patrick's Cathedral when it went off the air. Marcus nodded and changed the display on the projection screen to a live view of Earth. Ivy was shocked by how far the fire had spread during the few minutes she'd been in here. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and discovered a series of messages from Cal sent during the last several minutes.
Hey, you busy? Okay, I guess you got pulled away. In case we get cut off, I love you. We'll look for a mermaid like you said, but no substitute for you. Lost contact with Norfolk. No chain above me. Holy crap, it is getting hot. Diving. Bye.
And the last message in the series was a photograph snapped on his cell phone's camera. It took Ivy a minute of panning and zooming to figure out what she was seeing. Cal had taken the photo while standing in the conning tower of his boat, looking straight up the ladder at the open hatch above him. This provided a tunnel vision view of a disk of sky. The sky was on fire. In his other hand, he was holding up his engagement ring, a simple band of polished titanium. He was holding it between his thumb and index finger, shooting the picture through the ring, making it concentric with the disk of the burning sky. She looked up. Someone had spoken her name.
Mine just faded away,
Doob told her. I beg your pardon, Dr. Harris? Ivy said, the morgue's manners triumphing over all circumstances.
I had been gearing up for these final goodbyes with Amelia, with my kids,
Doob said. He spoke quietly, without marked emotion, as if relating a mildly surprising anecdote.
But, you know, the communications just broke down slowly over a couple of days, and there was never really a goodbye.
Very well, Marcus said. I will make the announcement.
Hot enough to bake taters on hood of this truck.
Go inside, Dad.
Not kidding about thermal effects. Ain't bubbling.
I am not kidding either. You have to get inside.
Got a space blanket to protect me when I make a run for it.
Then for God's sake, use it, Dad.
Ah, but then I can't chew the rag with you any longer, Dinah.
What if your gas tank explodes?
Ha ha, we drained it for generator fuel. Way ahead of you, kid.
God, you are a smartass. Dinah was keying this in, thankful that Morse code still worked when your vision was blurred by tears and your voice choked by sobs, when a voice came out of a speaker. It was Marcus's voice.
This is Marcus Luker.
I know you are, she answered. Then she understood that Marcus was speaking on the all-arc PA system, which supposedly reached into every corner of Izzy, as well as to all of the arclets. They had tested it a few times with pre-recorded messages, but never actually used it. Marcus considered the thing a relic of the 20th century and detested it. Communications ought to be targeted. Busy people ought not to be interrupted by disembodied voices barking from speakers.
The Cloud Arc Constitution is now in effect.
Dinah drew breath, knowing what this meant. Marcus spelled it out anyway.
This means that all nation-states of Earth and their governments and constitutions no longer exist. Their military and civilian chains of command are no more. Oaths you may have taken to them, allegiances you may have held, loyalties you may have felt, citizenships you may have had are now and forever dissolved. The rights granted you by the Cloud Arc Constitution, no more and no less, are your rights. The laws and responsibilities of the Cloud Arc Constitution now bind you. You are citizens of a new nation now. The only nation. Long may it endure.
She keyed. Marcus is calling it.
Who said he was boss?
Rufus's transmission was getting scratchy. Dinah wiped her eyes and looked out her window to see Earth encircled by a belt of fire. The trails of the incoming meteorites, once a pattern of bright scratches in the air, had merged into a blinding continuum of superheated air that had set fire to anything on the surface capable of burning. Since more of the rocks were coming in around the equator, the belt of radiance and fire was brightest there. But north and south of it, long swaths of the surface were aflame, and the belt was widening to envelop the high latitudes of Canada and South America. She transmitted, "About to lose you. Tell Bob and Ed and GT and Rex I love them. And Bev."
"Already did, but will again. Christ, it is hot."
"Get inside, Dad."
"Don't worry. I'm right by the door. Can hear them all singing Bread of Heaven."
"Then go join the chorus, Dad."
"Okay. Bob and Ed are coming out to grab me. Bye, honey. Do us proud. QRT."
QRT, 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 QRT. She wasn't sure how many times she keyed that in. She pulled herself out of her sobs later by imagining what had happened. Her brothers, Bob and Ed, dressed in silver fireman suits, rushing out of the mine's entrance to haul Dad out of the old pickup truck, wrapping him in the space blanket to keep him from being broiled by the sky, and dragging him inside. An inch-thick steel plate being slammed across the doorway. The welders going to work laying down fat fillets made to last 5,000 years. Once that was done, the heavy machinery fired up, shoving tons of rock and gravel up against the steel plate to bolster it against any shock waves powerful enough to punch it out of its frame. Then silence, save maybe for the distant thuds of meteorite strikes. And sitting around the table to say grace and tuck into the first of 15,000 or so meals that the Macquaries and their descendants would have to prepare and eat, if they were ever to escape from that tomb. They had 500 people down there, and, at least on paper, enough food-growing capacity to keep that many alive. Exactly how you made that a sustainable proposition wasn't clear to Dinah. She hadn't bothered Rufus for every last little detail of his plan. Marcus's announcement was continuing. He was telling everyone what they already knew, which was that Earth was over, and that the great dying that they had been expecting for the last 2 years was now in the past. Everyone knew it, but someone had to say it. He asked for 704 seconds of silence. 1 second for each of the days that had passed since 0. About 12 minutes. All non-essential duties would be suspended during that time, and it would be the sole responsibility of the survivors to think and remember and mourn. After that, they must put Earth in the past, as a thing that had once been, and apply their minds to what was now. Drawn up into a fetal position, Dinah hovered alone in the middle of her shop, listening to weird squeals and hisses coming out of her radio speaker. Alone, of all the people in the Cloud Ark, she knew that her family was still alive, and might go on being alive for a long time. It was not clear to her whether this was better or worse than simply knowing that they were dead. All she had to go on was, "Do us proud," her father's final transmission. Morse code didn't leave a paper trail or an email thread on the screen of your tablet. She would never be able to scroll back and reread the exchange she'd just had with Rufus. She hoped she'd said the right things, and that he'd remember it well, and that he would tell the others about it at dinner this evening. She tried then to mourn for all the others who had died, but it was too big. Emotionally, it was little different from reading about a great war that had happened 100 years ago, which maybe was Marcus's whole point. Even though the dying was still going on, they had to force themselves to think about it like the Irish potato famine, or like what had happened to the peoples of the New World when Columbus had arrived and infected them with a slew of deadly diseases. Regret, even horror, were appropriate, but detachment was necessary. They all had 704 seconds in which to effect that detachment. So Dinah thought about what exactly would be entailed in doing Rufus McQuarrie proud. There was a simple answer, which had to do with doing the right thing, being honorable, upholding a few rough and ready ethical standards, a sort of frontier code of conduct. All of which was easy to understand, if not always quite so easy to live up to. But Rufus was not a cowboy, and he certainly wasn't a preacher. He was a miner, a delver, a demolisher, a builder, a businessman. If he lived by a simple code of ethics, it was not an end in itself, but a way to get something done without selling his soul or destroying his reputation. It was a tool to be wielded like a shovel or a stick of dynamite. Tools were for building things, and pride was something you could feel after the fact, when you stood back, looked at what you had built, and passed it on to your children. Dinah could spend the rest of her life living by her word, giving everyone a fair shake, and all of that. Rufus would no doubt approve of all those things, but it was not the charge he had given her. He had told her, though not in so many words, to get busy building a future.
Are you about finished?
She turned her head to see Ivy hanging in the scrum, looking at Dinah through the hatch. We're only like 200 seconds into the...
Marcus said I could skip it. He sent me on a mission. I need your help,
Ivy said. Bitch.
Slut.
Shall we?
Remember when the internet was new and some people in your life just didn't get it?
Ivy asked. She was preceding Dinah through the seemingly endless maze of docked modules and hamster tubes, headed toward the periphery of Izzy. People in my world got it pretty fast. You don't know many miners, do you?
Not in my world. We had these throwbacks who would do stuff like printing their emails out on paper to read them, or asking you for your goddamn fax number 2 decades after you had thrown away your fax machine.
They were hurtling through an otherwise perfectly silent space station, still only about 5 minutes into the 12 minutes of silence. Faces in open hatches would turn to look at them in shock, then recognize them, and go back to mourning, praying, meditating, or whatever it was that they were doing. Dinah understood that this was terribly important, but was secretly pleased that Ivy had given her dispensation to get to work. How does that apply to...
The system works. Perambulator and all of that. As long as every ship in the Cloud Ark is playing by those rules. Logged onto the system, communicating with agreed-on protocols, obeying the dictates of the swarm. If even one is just hanging out and doing its own thing, well, it might as well be a meteoroid, in terms of its destructive potential.
We've got one of those?
A few of them, but one in particular that is causing havoc.
Any collisions yet, or?
No, but every time it draws near, it triggers an explosion of red in perambulator, and 100 arklets have to burn fuel to alter their courses. It's like the whole Cloud Ark is turning somersaults around the movements of this one ship.
What is it?
Optically, it's an X-37.
Fits,
Dinah said. Yeah.
Translation. Someone had looked at the craft through a telescope and thought it looked like a Boeing X-37 orbital test vehicle, which resembled a miniature space shuttle. It was so miniature, in fact, that it couldn't carry any crew. It had a cargo bay that accounted for most of its fuselage. It had been developed by DARPA in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when it had become obvious that the space shuttle was going to be phased out, and they needed a small, easily launched vehicle that could go up and, by remote control, perform maintenance tasks on the United States fleet of military satellites. Since then, it had come in for very little actual use, but when it was used, it was for black-budget spook stuff that Dinah and Ivy wouldn't know about. It was a footnote in history. Obsolescent. Not designed for the requirements of the Cloud Ark. It had probably been launched into orbit by some trigger-happy launch crew that just wanted to send up everything they could. With a sufficient amount of sifting through old emails, they might be able to find some record of who had launched it and what, if any, cargo was aboard. But for now, it was easier to just go and look at the damned thing. Nearly all the engineering that had gone into it had been devoted to the problem of re-entry. Most of its proudest features were therefore useless to them. Approaching the end of a side stack, they were able to see through the round orifice of a port into the vehicle docked to its far side. A flivver, or flexible light intracloud vehicle. These had begun showing up a few months ago. They were the jeeps of the Cloud Ark, the small utility vehicles used to move people and valuable stuff from one arklet to another, or between an arklet and Izzy. Because they didn't have to operate in the atmosphere, they had the same general utilitarian look as the arklets, but the pressure hull was smaller in diameter, and instead of an inflatable outer hull, the flivver had more practical stuff. 2 different styles of docking ports, an airlock big enough to accommodate a human in an orlan, a robot arm, lights, thrusters. At Dinah's suggestion, they had studded the pressure hull with attachment points that a grab could latch onto. This made it possible for each flivver to carry its own complement of grabs, siwais, buckies, and gnats, which swarmed all over it like crabs, remoras, and sea lice. Instead of being limited by the hard-engineered capabilities of the robot arm, the flivver was constrained only by the imagination and ingenuity of the programmer inside, telling the robots what to do. The silvery blur of Tekla's head poked out in front of them. Apparently, she'd been dispatched to assist with closing the hatch and undocking the flivver. She'd been waiting in the adjacent DC, or docking compartment, which was just a small side module tacked on to serve as an airlock and provide a little extra space for personnel in cases like this. She drew her head back in to make space as Ivy and then Dinah cruised by her. As soon as those two were inside the flivver, Tekla emerged and exchanged a nod with Ivy. "Lamprey is in airlock and is functioning," Tekla said, and closed the hatch. Dinah had some ambivalent feelings about Tekla, but there was no one she'd rather work with in a case like this. She was all business. She got the job done without useless conversation or touchy-feely stuff. Dinah closed the flivver's hatch and began going through the undocking sequence while Ivy, strapped into the vehicle's pilot seat, ran down the pre-excursion checklist. Befitting a craft that had been designed in a hurry to be flexible and light, this wasn't that lengthy. And so Flivver 3, one of a fleet of 8, was underway before Marcus's 704 seconds of silence had quite expired. Dinah strapped into a jump seat beside Ivy's. The flivver's front-end dome consisted largely of windows, bolstered by a sturdy web of curved aluminum struts, so from behind, Ivy looked like a bombardier seated in the glass nose of a World War II bomber. She touched the controls and made the craft rotate in a way that caused Earth to pass beneath them, and then the resemblance became stronger. Dinah was reminded of a painting Rufus had shown her, depicting a bomber flying over a burning city, red light flooding into the plane from below. The same effect held now, save that the firestorm covered most of the surface of the Earth. "I can feel the warmth on my face," Ivy said. Dinah couldn't think of anything useful to say to that. During their passage from her shop to the flivver, she had forgotten about the fact that the Earth was burning, and she didn't enjoy being reminded of it. Instead, she tried to focus on the red light emanating coolly from the screen of her tablet, which was running perambulator. Flivver 3 had been picked up on the swarm's collective sensorium and identified as a bogey that might potentially collide with as many as 100 different arklets if it stayed on its current course. Rather than controlling its thrusters directly, which would lead at best to confusion and at worst to a chain reaction disaster, Ivy was negotiating a solution with the rest of the Cloud Ark, telling it where she wanted to go and finding a way of getting there that would minimize the amount of maneuvering demanded of all the others. It was not a speedy way of getting around, and indeed ran at right angles to the fighter jockey ethos of many of the ex-military types who had come up here in the astronaut and cosmonaut corps. But as they got farther away from Izzy, they were able to move into orbits that caused minimal consternation to the rest of the cloud, and move in a more direct way to rendezvous with the wayward X-37. This had been placed, by whoever the hell had launched it, in an orbit with the same plane and period as the cloud arc, but with somewhat greater eccentricity. The orbit of Izzy, and hence of the cloud arc, was almost perfectly circular. The X-37's was more oval, meaning that about half of the time it was beneath the cloud arc, and the rest of the time it was above, but twice, during each 93-minute orbit, it crossed through, each time touching off the havoc that was wasting so much propellant and causing so much annoyance to Marcus. Right now it was above, and due to cross over in another 20 minutes.
Any bolides we need to worry about before I focus on this?
Ivy asked her. Nothing in particular, Dina said, meaning that there was nothing so big as to force the entire cloud arc to make a course change.
Let's make this fast, then,
Ivy said, and went over to manual control. For they were now far enough away from the cloud arc that she could execute solo maneuvers without making perambulator screens turn solid red.
Can you scope it?
Dina spent a minute refamiliarizing herself with the user interface for the optical telescope mounted to the flivver's nose. This was an electronic eyeball about the size of an orange. The controls were intuitive, but getting it to aim at a particular bogey took a bit of doing. Soon enough, though, she was able to see something white and bright. She locked onto it and zoomed in. From longer zoom, it was clearly a winged craft with a black nose, like the shuttle of old, but it seemed to have taken on added parts. Zooming in further, she was able to see that the cargo bay doors that constituted most of the X-37's back had been opened at some point after it had reached orbit. Its payload had then been lifted out of the bay using the built-in robotic arm, which was still holding it, frozen in position. The payload was almost as big as the X-37 itself. It was yet another dome-ended cylinder. But unlike a flivver or an arclet, it lacked thrusters or any sort of visible power source. It was just a burnished aluminum capsule, gleaming white on one side from sunshine, red below where it reflected the planetary firestorm. Ivy was looking at it too, dividing her attention between the flivver's status displays and the window running this optical feed.
Can you get more detail on the forward end? There's a fitting there that might be a...
Yeah, Dina said, zooming in and panning to center it. That's a docking port, all right.
Well, I guess we're being invited to dock with it,
Ivy said. It's weird. I don't like it.
I agree, Ivy said, but we can't come back later. That thing is tiny, less than 4 feet in diameter. If there's humans in there, they are running out of stuff to breathe.
Why would they send a human up in something like that?
It's some plan that went awry. An email didn't get answered. A transmission got garbled. Now these people are marooned and probably waiting to die.
Ivy spoke brusquely, a little irked by Dina's questions. Dina heard thrusters pop and felt them nudging her around as Ivy maneuvered. She knew better than to distract her friend when her brain had gone into orbital mechanics mode. She unbuckled herself from the jump seat and moved to the docking port on the flivver's top surface, steadying herself by reaching out to grab the adjacent handles whenever Ivy effected a little course adjustment. Within a few minutes, Ivy had matched orbits, maneuvered the flivver into the right attitude, and driven it straight onto the capsule's docking port. Got a positive mate? Dina remarked. She activated a valve that flooded the little space between the flivver's hatch and the capsules with air. Here goes nothing. She opened the flivver's hatch. She was now looking at the outside of the capsule's hatch, which, until a few seconds earlier, had been exposed to space. A strange detail. Taped to the aluminum hatch was an ordinary sheet of 8.5 by 11-inch North American printer paper. On this had been printed a color image. a yellow ring encircling a blue disk lined with stars. Spread-eagled on its center, an eagle with a red and white striped shield. The printer that had spat this thing out had been low on cyan ink, and so the image was strangely banded and discolored. Exposure to space hadn't done it any favors either. Even though the United States had only ceased to exist a few minutes earlier, declared extinct by Marcus under the authority granted him by the Cloud Ark Constitution, this image already seemed as old and quaint to Dinah as a pilgrim or a musketeer. She heard a mechanism activating on the other side of it. "It's alive!" she called. Then, in spite of this effort at jocularity, she held her breath. The hatch swung open to reveal a haggard, space-bloated, sickly green face, hair floating around it in disarray. But the eyes in that face were as cold and hard as ever, and they were fixed on Dinah.
"Dinah,"
the woman said. It was her voice, more than her face, that Dinah recognized.
"Even in these tragic circumstances, what a relief to see a familiar face."
"Madam Dinah began. Then she caught herself. Julia Bliss Flaherty looked as if she didn't appreciate one bit being addressed that way. Ivy was using the thrusters quite a bit. Now that the flivver, the capsule, and the X-37 were all joined together mechanically into a single object, it was possible, though awkward, to maneuver them into sync with the Cloud Ark and clean up all of that perambulator red. There was some lurching. Julia was getting knocked around a little, learning she had to keep a grip on those handles. Random stuff, including some filled barf bags and a large number of what looked like red marbles, were careering around inside her tiny capsule. Looking through it during a moment when Julia had been flung to one side, Dinah saw a man floating in the far end of the capsule. He was bloody, and he was kind of floppy too. He was dressed in the remains of a navy blue suit. He was not the ex-first gentleman. "I'm sorry for your loss," Dinah said.
"Who the hell is that?" Ivy was shouting. "Marcus wants to know if we have survivors."
"My loss?" Julia asked. "Your husband," Dinah said.
"He took the pill,"
Julia announced. "In the limo."
"Oh my God. I'll need your help getting Mr. Starling squared away. He's too big for me to move."
"No, he isn't," Dinah said.
"I beg your pardon,"
Julia said sharply. "You're in 0G," Dinah pointed out, "so he's not too big for you to move. But I can still help you if you want."
"If you would be so kind,"
Julia said. She got a hand over the rim of the hatch while reaching out with the other for a shoulder bag, and looked expectantly at Dinah, who was still blocking her path. Dinah looked at the back of Ivy's head. "Julia Bliss Flaherty requests permission to come aboard." Julia let out a hiss of exasperation.
"Granted,"
Ivy said. "One casualty on the way, too," Dinah said, and cleared out of Julia's way. Julia launched herself through the hatch too hard, flew across the flivver, and slammed into the far side of it, elbow and shoulder first. "Oof!" she cried. But Dinah didn't think she was hurt, and so she pushed through into the capsule. One of those red marbles was drifting toward her face, and she reached out with a hand to brush it away before realizing that it was blood. Pete Starling was suffering from a number of lacerations, as if he'd been in a stick fight or a car crash. He was groggy and gagging on blood, probably from a broken nose, which he would cough out explosively when it got in the way of his breathing. Dinah grasped the lapel of his jacket, trying to find a usable handhold. When she pulled on it, the front of the coat came away from Starling's chest for a moment, revealing an empty shoulder holster. No matter now. She planted her feet, put her back into it, and got him stretched out in the middle of the capsule, head aimed toward the docking port, drifting slowly in that direction. She was looking to Julia to reach through and pull her companion through the hole, But Julia, banged up from her first attempt to move, was still flailing around, learning the basics of zero-G locomotion the hard way. Dina was at the back of the capsule, staring at Pete's feet, which were kicking weakly. One of his feet was stocking-clad. The other still wore an expensive-looking leather shoe. She grabbed a foot with each hand and tried to push him toward the docking port, but he reacted against it. He had no idea what was going on, didn't understand that he was in space, didn't like having his feet grabbed. She moved forward, got her waist between his knees, hugged him around the thighs, squeezing his legs together to either side of her body, and tried to get him re-aimed toward the port. She heard a sharp pop and felt warm, wet stuff all over her arms. More of it had splashed up her throat, all the way to the point of her chin. She smelled shit and heard a loud hissing noise. Pete Starling jerked once and then went limp. She looked up toward the source of the hiss and saw starlight through a jagged hole in the skin of the capsule. The hole was about the size of a man's thumb. Triangles of metal were bent back away from it. On second thought, the hissing was coming from two places at once. Another hole had been punched in the other side of the capsule. Pete Starling's body was between the two holes. The middle of his torso was just a rib-lined crater. Blood was hurtling out of it and accelerating through both holes. Her ears had popped several times already. She looked down the length of the capsule at Julia, who had finally gotten herself properly oriented and was looking into the hatch, wild-eyed, utterly confused. "Julia," Dina said, "we've been struck by a small bolide. We're losing air, but not that fast. Pete's dead. He's in my way. If you could reach through and grab him by the collar and pull him toward you—" The conversation and her view of Julia's face was cut off by the flivver's hatch swinging shut. Any curve you could make by slicing a cone with a plane, a circle, an ellipse, a parabola, or a hyperbola, could be the shape of an orbit. For practical purposes, though, all orbits were ellipses, and most of the naturally occurring orbits in the solar system, those of the planets around the sun, or of moons around planets, were ellipses so round as to be indistinguishable, by the naked eye, from circles. This was not because nature especially favored circles. It was because highly elongated elliptical orbits tended not to last for very long. As a body in a highly eccentric orbit went rocketing in toward the central body and executed a hairpin turn at the periapsis, the point of closest approach, it was subject to tidal forces that could break it up. It might strike the central body's atmosphere or, in the case of heliocentric orbits, come too close to the sun's heat and suffer thermal damage. If it survived the plunge through periapsis, it would fly out on a long trajectory that would take it across the orbits of other bodies. After rounding the turn at apoapsis, the point of maximum distance, it would cycle back across the same set of orbits on its way back in toward the center. The solar system was sparse, and so the odds that it would strike, or come close to, any given planet or asteroid on any given circuit were small. But over astronomical spans of time, the likelihood of a close encounter or collision was high. Collision would, of course, result in a meteorite strike on the planet and the destruction of the formerly orbiting body. A mere close encounter would perturb the body's orbit into a new and different ellipse, or possibly into a hyperbola, which would eject it from the solar system altogether. The sun still maintained a stable of comets and asteroids in highly eccentric orbits, but their number dwindled over time, and they were rare events to astronomers. In its early eons, the solar system had been a much more chaotic place, with a wider range of orbits. But the processes mentioned had gradually swept it clean and, by a kind of natural selection, produced a system in which nearly everything was moving in an almost circular orbit. What was true of the solar system as a whole had also been true of the Earth-Moon system. The Moon had circled the Earth in a nearly circular orbit. From time to time, a wandering stone from deep space would blunder in through a libration point and get captured into a geocentric orbit. But sooner or later, it would hit the Moon, hit the Earth, or be ejected by a close encounter with one of those bodies. Thus had the Moon swept Earth's skies for billions of years and protected it from most big meteor strikes, making it a suitable place for the development of complex ecosystems and civilizations. All the rocks that made up the white sky had once shared the Moon's orbit, and most of them, for the time being, remained at a safe distance of about 400,000 kilometers. Their orbits, for now, were of low eccentricity, meaning that they were nearly circular. However, the vast number of chaotic interactions within the white sky had spawned a diversity of orbits. Some of those orbits were highly eccentric, meaning that their apogees might be far away, but their perigees were close to the Earth. Close enough to get caught up in its atmosphere or to strike it directly. Any rock whose orbit was eccentric enough to come near the Earth could also come near Izzy. In general, rocks in such orbits were moving at about 11,000 meters per second when they were that close to Earth. A bolide the size of a peppercorn, moving at that velocity, would have the same kinetic energy as a high-powered rifle bullet. Of course, high-powered bullets were designed to strike things with great force and do damage in a predictable way, while moon rocks weren't designed at all, so the results of collisions could be unpredictable. What had probably happened in this case was that a rock closer in size to a chickpea, and packing the energy of several rifle bullets, had punched through the wall of the capsule but, in so doing, fractured into several pieces that had sprayed outward across the capsule's volume in a narrow cone, striking Pete Starling's body something like a shotgun blast, but with much more total kinetic energy. Most of that energy had gone into his flesh and caused him to basically explode. The largest single piece of the original rock had kept going through his body, or perhaps missed him entirely, and punched its way out through the opposite side of the capsule. If the rock had passed a couple of meters to either side, it would have missed them entirely, and they wouldn't even have known it was there. In the Earth's atmosphere, of course, it would have been a different story. The rock would have dissolved in a bright streak, turning most of its kinetic energy into heat. The air in its immediate vicinity would have gotten warmer for a bit. Had it happened at night, keen observers might have seen a streak of light. When the same thing happened on a large scale all over the Earth, the air became so hot that it glowed, as it was doing now. In any case, Dinah now found herself locked into a capsule, lit only by a few strips of white LEDs that were darkened by blood spatter, as the air leaked out of it. She had, of course, been drilling for events such as this one for a significant part of her life. One of the first things they taught you was that the air wasn't really leaking out as quickly as you thought. Only so much air could get through a small hole. Nevertheless, plugging those holes was life or death. So Dinah's first move, once she had recovered from surprise, was to shove Pete Starling's remains up toward the larger of the two holes, the one through which the bolide had entered. With a wet sucking sound, his bloody flesh sealed that hole. Her ears now enabled her to find the smaller exit hole, which was about the size of her pinky. She slapped her bloody hand over it. The hiss stopped, and she immediately felt a space hickey begin to form where the big hoover was trying to pull her flesh out into the void. It hurt, but not that badly. She listened for a few moments until she was satisfied that there were no other hissing noises, no other leaks. A bloody bandage floated past. She snatched it out of the air, peeled her hand away from the hole, and stuffed it in there. Some of it got sucked out into space, but then it formed into a wad that moved no further. The hole was still hissing, though, so she grabbed an empty plastic bag and shaped that over the irregular mound of wet gauze. The vacuum sucked it inward and created a nearly airtight seal. A softer hiss, more of a whooshing noise, emanated from the back of the capsule. Dinah's ears felt a change in pressure, but they didn't pop, suggesting that the pressure had just increased. She knew nothing about this capsule, but she did know how simple life support systems worked, and she knew that they would likely contain a store of compressed oxygen that would be bled in to compensate for what was being turned into CO2 in the occupants' bodies and absorbed by the scrubbers. The mechanism was probably trying to compensate for the air that had just been voided into space, bringing the pressure back up to normal. If that were the case, then it should now be possible to open the hatch on the flivver. Dinah floated toward it, reached through the capsule's open hatch, and rapped on the metal, leaving bloody knuckle prints. Nothing happened for a moment, and so she rapped out SOS. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. The hatch opened to reveal Ivy's face. "My goodness gracious," she said. "Thanks, sister," Dinah said, and vaulted through as Ivy got out of the way. Partly just to be accommodating, but largely, Dinah assumed, to avoid getting smeared with the bodily fluids of Julia's late science advisor. Julia herself was strapped into one of the jump seats, buckled over into a fetal position, suffering from the dry heaves, and keeping an eye on Dinah out of the corner of her eye. "Welcome to space," was on the tip of Dinah's tongue, but she managed to stifle it. "Well, you were, busy. We flew through the cloud arc again. We have about 45 minutes now on its nadir side," Ivy said. "Should be enough," Dinah said. She strapped herself into the other jump seat, wiped her hands on her thighs, and pulled her laptop close. Holding it down with the heels of her hand so it wouldn't float away, she brought up the set of interface windows that she used to communicate with robots. Over the course of a few seconds, the laptop established communication with all the robots that were within range, which is to say, that were riding along on the outside of this flivver. Meanwhile, she pulled down a folding arm with a mitten-like contraption on its end. This was the interface for the flivver's external robot arm. "Hop the airlock for me, sweetie?" she said. "Already done, hun," Ivy returned. In her peripheral vision, she could see Julia's eyes swiveling back and forth, reacting to this exchange. She tried to ignore Julia in spite of, perhaps because of, her weird talent for demanding attention, and focused on the video feed from the camera on the end of the robot arm. The airlock's round orifice grew larger as she reached toward it, revealing the device Tekla had stashed inside. The lamprey was a box with a blinking light on it. On the side facing the airlock door, it sported a lug, or handle. With the hand on the robot arm, Dinah was able to grapple this easily and pull the device out into the light. "Any reason not to just beamer it onto the X-37's arm?" she asked. "Can't think of any." "What is it you're doing?" Julia asked. "Deorbiting that piece of space junk before it kills someone." "That piece of space junk happens to be carrying the earthly remains of a brave man who gave his life in the name of—" Dinah said, "Ivy, you want to take this, or should I?" "I'll do it. You're busy," Ivy said. Dinah could hear her twisting around in the pilot's seat to look at Julia. She spoke as follows. "Julia, shut up. If you say another fucking word, I'll stave your fucking head in and put your corpse out the airlock. Nothing about this is acceptable, starting with the fact that you are flapping your gums, posing a distraction to Dinah while she is carrying out a difficult, mission-critical operation to protect the Cloud Ark. You just attempted to countermand a direct order from Marcus, who is in charge of everything here under the PSAPS clause of the Cloud Ark Constitution. You are up here illegally. The Crater Lake Accord specifically barred the sending of national leaders to the Cloud Ark. You have violated that commitment and found a way to be launched up here anyhow, and judging from the looks of it, there was no end of dirty dealing along the way. Your vehicle approached the cloud arc in a manner incompatible with our safety and security procedures, endangering the lives of everyone up here and forcing Arklets and Izzy itself to expend priceless and irreplaceable fuel to perform evasive maneuvers. We were sent here on an emergency basis, placing ourselves in harm's way and expending more scarce resources to clean up the mess that you created by your cowardly and dishonorable act. For all of these reasons, I am commanding you, by my authority as the commander of this vessel, to remain silent until we have docked safely at Izzy." "Very well," Julia said. Dina looked up from her work to see Ivy and Julia glaring at each other. "I'm sorry," Julia said. "You really are asking for it," Dina told her, and then she went back to work. She had already accomplished much during Ivy's soliloquy. The task at hand was to somehow attach the lamprey to the X-37. The connection didn't have to look good, but it did have to be solid. Back in the days when every maneuver had been planned years in advance by NASA, this would have been a several hours-long operation making use of custom-designed hardware. But lately the people of the Cloud Ark had been obliged to get good at lassoing random pieces of floating space junk. And so she ended up using a more highly evolved version of the trick that Reese had come up with for reining in Tekla's Luke. On that occasion, Dina had fashioned a whip by chaining Cywise together. It had worked, but it was much heavier and more complicated than it needed to be. After the completion of T3 had left Reese with some free time on his hands, he had begun tinkering with surplus gnats. Being old and obsolete, these were big, clunky, slow, and stupid compared to the new models, which was fine for Reese's purposes. He had turned them into a new kind of robot that he dubbed the Flink, for Flying Link, and taught them to be really good at forming themselves up into chains and then doing the sorts of maneuvers in space that his great-great-great-great-uncle John and Herr Professor Kucharski of Berlin could only have dreamed about. There was much room for creativity here, but he had focused most of his efforts on problems that needed to be solved all the time, such as precisely the one Dina needed to solve right now. The robot arm of the X-37 was sticking awkwardly out into space, an obvious target for grappling. A chain with a free end would whip around it easily, just as Reese had once ensnared Dina's index finger with his necklace. All Dina needed was a suitable chain. She happened to have one. A necklace of third-generation flinks spiraled around the flivver's hull, ready for use. One end of it was already connected to the lamprey. By invoking some computer code, she was able to set the rest of it into motion, unwinding itself from around the flivver and snaking out into free space, forming a U-shaped bend, or Knickstelle, that was aimed at the X-37's robot arm. "Ready to undock now," she said. Ivy had moved back to the port through which their guest had entered. "Undocking," she said, and began running through the checklist that undocked the flivver from the X-37. Dina, meanwhile, moved up to the pilot's console and punched in a programmed series of thruster burns. As soon as Ivy confirmed separation, Dina executed the program, effecting a small delta V that made them back away from the X-37. The Knickstelle went into motion, as if the chain were passing around an invisible pulley, and began to propagate away from the flivver and toward the X-37. Presently, the chain's end whipped around the robot arm and spiraled about it several times before grapplers on the flinks found each other and engaged, lashing the chain into place for good. Dina released the lamprey from the grip of the flivver's robot arm. The flink chain, still following a canned program, pulled the lamprey in and made it fast to the X-37. The flink chain, the X-37, and the lamprey were now a single object, and would remain thus until they were destroyed. Dina brought up the interface that controlled the lamprey. This was a fire-and-forget device, but someone did have to fire it. She spun a control wheel that adjusted the box's attitude, aiming its business end in a safe direction. Getting things out of orbit was almost as complicated as launching them. Once a thing was in a legitimate, stable orbit, you couldn't just drop it toward the Earth. It would stay in orbit indefinitely unless you slowed it down. Slowing it down generally meant using thrusters, which meant spending fuel. The lamprey was a simple alternative. "We're undocked," Ivy announced, moving back forward to the pilot's chair. "Gonna nudge us free." A couple of pops from the thrusters signaled that they were gaining some distance from the X-37. Ivy spun the flivver around so that they could see the X-37 perhaps 100 meters away, floating upside down above the burning Earth, the elbow of its arm projecting toward the nadir, the lamprey strapped to it and blinking. "Okay, the lamprey is giving me all green thingies. I see no red thingies, so I am activating it in 3, 2, 1, now." Dina tapped the Deorbit button. Most of the lamprey, the entire box, jumped away, headed toward Earth, propelled by white plumes of solid rocket exhaust. After a couple of seconds, the motors burned themselves out, and the box continued to coast away, unreeling a wire behind it. This came to a stop a minute later, dangling half a kilometer below the X-37 and pulled taut by tidal force. "We have positive current flow in the tether," Dina reported, "so it's working." The wire, sweeping through Earth's magnetic field on its orbit, was picking up a weak electrical current, creating a force that would slow the X-37 down. The effect was slight, but within a few hours the X-37's orbit would decay to the point where it no longer posed a danger to the cloud arc. And in days or weeks, it would descend into the atmosphere and be annihilated. 20 minutes remained before the flivver's orbit would next cross Izzy's. But the physical separation was only a few tens of kilometers, and they were still on swarm, meaning that the flivver's computer was talking to the Cloud Arc network and searching parameter space for the safest and most efficient way to reintegrate with it and to dock. That, plus the lamprey's success in moving the X-37 out of the way, ought to have cleared up most of the red that had been maculating perambulator displays at the time of their departure. But when Dina and Ivy turned their attention back to those screens, they looked worse than before. It was not immediately clear why. Perambulator was a beautiful thing from the standpoint of mathematics and data visualization, but there were times when you just wanted to know what the hell was happening. You wanted a narrative. A text came through on Ivy's phone. It was from Marcus. She read it out loud. "Approach using visual observation and manual control," it said. "Warning, collision debris." "Already?" Dina exclaimed. It wasn't a good start if they'd already suffered a bolide strike a couple of hours into the hard rain. "It was fratricide," Ivy said, still reading. "Looks like an arclet got cornered." Getting cornered was a problem that had arisen in simulations. The swarm, as a whole, would look for solutions that would prevent arclets from banging into each other with minimum expenditure of propellant. In a pinch, of course, it was okay to burn a lot of propellant to avoid a collision. But there were situations where a collision was going to happen no matter what, and there was nothing to do for it but choose the least damaging outcome. Getting cornered wasn't supposed to happen. Everything about Perambulator was supposed to prevent it. But the number of possible scenarios was infinite, and nothing was ever certain. "A controlled collision," Ivy said. "No fatalities, but then some follow-on. Still being evaluated. There might be loose debris drifting around. That's why he wants me to fly it in manually." "What kind of debris?" Dina asked. "Hard stuff or thermal protection, looks like," Ivy said. "So that's good." Apparently one of the modules, or an arclet, had lost some of the layers of reflective foil and insulation that were used to shield it from the heat of the sun. The stuff was feather light, and so probably didn't pose much of a threat to the flivver, but it would look huge on radar and make Perambulator go crazy. Ivy, in the pilot's chair, was monopolizing the only window. Dinah didn't like flying blind, so she pulled up the interface for the flivver's eyeball camera. Julia began to make a weird repetitive noise, a sort of wet, gurgling drone. She was snoring.
"Long day for her, I guess,"
Ivy remarked. Yeah. Dinah had no precedence to tell her how she should feel toward the ex-president at a time like this. On the one hand, her behavior had been reprehensible. On the other, she had, within the last few hours, lost her husband, her daughter, her country, and her job. With a few moments panning around, Dinah was able to center Izzy in the camera's frame, then zoom in. Izzy was on the night side of the Earth just now. In normal times, or what used to be normal, it would have been dark. But now she was lit up from below by the red glow of the atmosphere, punctuated from time to time by bluish flashes, like lightning strikes, as large bolides plowed into the air 300 kilometers below. Of course, Dinah had never seen Izzy so illuminated, and it took a bit of getting used to. From a distance, Izzy looked fine, but at higher magnification, Dinah began to see visual noise that gradually resolved into drifting bits of debris, the shredded thermal protection that Ivy had mentioned. Izzy had become unfathomably complicated in the last 2 years. Dinah rarely saw it from a distance, so she didn't have a strong sense of what was normal. But the more she zoomed in, the more certain she became that something weird had happened on the nadir side, near the junction of Zvezda and Zarya. Complicated though she might be, Izzy was complicated in a way that was orderly, stiff, and stable. The one exception to that rule was Amalthea, but even that had become more regular as the mining colony's robots had reshaped it. What Dinah was zooming in on now was messy, and it was unstable. Big expanses of thermal shielding material that had been torn loose and were now stirring randomly in the nearly imperceptible wind. At a glance, it did not look like a serious matter. Serious would have meant a hull breach, air erupting from a hole, perhaps dragging debris, or even human bodies along with it. "I'm thinking maybe a grazing impact at most," Dinah reported. "A near miss between an arclet or something and the nadir side of Zvezda. Destroyed some thermal shielding, but caused little if any structural damage." "They are reporting 0 serious casualties," Ivy said. "Some bumps and sprains aboard an arclet, so maybe you're right." "Maybe," Dinah said. For they had now drawn close enough that the camera could provide more detail. What had been exposed by the damage to the thermal shielding looked unfamiliar to her at first glance. A big T-shaped construct that jutted out to the nadir side of the stack like a pair of handlebars. It was studded with many long, neat rows of small, identical objects, gleaming in the occasional flashes from below. Finally, it all snapped into place in her head. She was looking at Moira's thing, the HGA, the Human Genetic Archive. Moira had given her a tour once, but that had been from the inside, or enclosed and pressurized part of it. Now Dinah was seeing the same thing from the outside. Until now, this had always been concealed from view by the thermal shielding. Once that was torn away, its internal structure could be seen, the rows and rows of hexagonal sample racks, each carrying its load of deep-frozen sperm, ova, or embryos, waiting in the near absolute zero, cold and dark of space. "How has Moira been doing with the dispersal project?" Dinah asked, forcing her voice to sound relaxed.
"Well, obviously the schedule got compressed when we learned about the 8-ball, just like all of our other preparations did. But I guess my real answer is that I don't know," Ivy said.